Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. The basement of no return. It was a normal afternoon, the kind of day where the air felt heavy, like it was waiting for something to happen. I was walking through the hallways of my school when I overheard a conversation between two of the teachers. They were speaking in hushed tones, as if they didn't want anyone to hear. Their words were muffled, but I could make out fragments. Something about the basement and don't let them go down there. My curiosity piqued. I decided to investigate. I had heard whispers about the school basement for as long as I could remember, rumors about strange noises, locked doors, and odd occurrences, but no one ever gave a clear explanation. It was just the kind of place that no one talked about, like it was a part of the school that had been forgotten. That afternoon, as the final bell rang and most of the students poured out of the building, I lingered behind, pretending to wait for my parents. I wasn't sure why I was drawn to the basement, but something felt off, like there was a story down there waiting to be uncovered. The basement door was hidden in the far corner of the school's storage hall, an old, rusted metal door that looked as though it hadn't been opened in years. It stood there, like a silent sentinel, waiting for someone to approach. I took a deep breath, my hand trembling as I reached for the doorknob. It creaked as I turned it, the sound slicing through the silence. When I stepped inside, the air was thick with dust. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into the darkness. The light above flickered intermittently, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the walls. I pulled my phone out of my pocket to use the flashlight, but as soon as I switched it on, the beam seemed weak, as if something was draining its power. I could feel my pulse quicken, but my feet kept moving forward, urging me deeper into the basement. The further I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as though the basement was alive, breathing in rhythm with my own heartbeat. There were old, wooden crates scattered across the floor, and broken shelves lined the walls, their contents long since rotted away. But it wasn't the decaying remnants that caught my attention. It was the cold, the unnatural chill that seemed to emanate from a door at the far end of the room, a door I had never seen before. It was solid, old wood, but the edges were dark, almost charred. I approached it slowly, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The door didn't have a handle, only a small latch at the top. I reached up, my fingers brushing against the rusted metal. As I touched it, a sharp, almost electric sensation ran through me, making my hair stand on end. The door rattled slightly as if something behind it had moved. Something about the room felt wrong, but I couldn't look away. I pushed the latch up with trembling fingers, the sound loud in the quiet basement. The door swung open on its own, revealing a narrow, pitch-black hallway beyond. I hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The hallway was long, the air thick and stale. I couldn't see anything past the first few feet. My phone's flashlight flickered once more, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement, a shadow crossing the far wall. I froze. It wasn't just the shadows of the basement, it was something moving, something that didn't belong. I heard a soft whisper from the end of the hall, a voice that sent chills down my spine. It was faint, like a distant echo, but clear enough to make my blood run cold. Leave now. My heart thudded in my chest as I backed away, but the whisper grew louder, more insistent. Leave now, or you'll never leave at all. I spun around, my breath quickening, and ran back down the hall, but the darkness seemed to stretch out endlessly, the door behind me closing by itself, sealing me in. Panic surged through me as I pounded on the door, my fist slamming against it, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The whisper grew into a growl, a low, guttural sound that vibrated the walls, and the temperature dropped even further, making it almost unbearable. I felt the air shift around me, a weight pressing against my chest, as if something invisible was watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. And then, the lights flickered once more, this time staying off. I was plunged into total darkness. I don't know how long I stood there, too terrified to move, too terrified to breathe. I could hear my heart beating loudly in my ears, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The only sound was the faint hum of something moving in the shadows, something alive. I finally forced myself to move, feeling along the wall, trying to find the way out. My fingers brushed against cold stone, and then, a door. I opened it, and to my relief, I found myself back in the basement, the door slamming shut behind me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran up the stairs, not stopping until I was outside, gasping for fresh air. I never went back to the basement again. The door was locked the next time I tried to find it, but I knew it wasn't just the door that was locked, it was the truth, something that should never be uncovered. There are things in that basement, things that shouldn't be there. And there are whispers, echoes of a past that won't let go. No one talks about the basement anymore, but I know better than to ask. Some doors are meant to stay closed. The asylum's echo. It was a dare, the kind of dare you regret accepting the moment you realize you're already in too deep. A group of us, 5 teens, bored and searching for something to break the monotony of summer, and gathered in the park. We were talking about the same things we always did: school, relationships, who was the next target for the latest rumor. But then someone brought up the old psychiatric hospital. It had been abandoned for years, ever since they closed it down in the late 90s. A place forgotten by most, except for the stories. The rumors. The whispers about the things that happened there. "Why don't we go in?" asked Tom, the instigator of most of our adventures. He was always the first to push boundaries, always eager to challenge the rest of us. We all hesitated. We'd heard the stories too, about the strange sounds echoing through the halls at night, about the patients who had died there under mysterious circumstances. And then there was the most terrifying rumor of all: the asylum wasn't entirely empty. Not even after all these years. But there was something about Tom's grin, that challenge in his eyes, that pushed us to make a decision. We'd done risky things before, but this felt different. Darker. Still, we all agreed, and by late evening, we stood in front of the decaying building, our hearts pounding in anticipation. The air was thick with humidity, the night sky covered with dark clouds. The hospital loomed in front of us, its broken windows like hollow eyes, staring out into the nothingness. The gate creaked as we pushed it open, the sound too loud for the silence surrounding the building. We stepped inside, our flashlights cutting through the gloom, illuminating cracked floors and walls covered in peeling paint. The smell of mildew and decay was overwhelming. We could feel the weight of the building pressing in on us, the silence suffocating. "I heard this place was shut down after a fire," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking slightly. She was the one who had always been the most cautious among us. But they never talked about what really happened. "Let's find out," Tom replied, his voice full of bravado, though I could tell he was just as unnerved as the rest of us. We moved deeper into the asylum, our footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The walls were covered in faded drawings, the remnants of those who had once been confined here, patients, perhaps, or staff. Every now and then, we would hear a soft creak, a faint noise in the distance, but no one dared to acknowledge it. We reached the main corridor, a long hallway that seemed to stretch on forever, with doors lining both sides. Most of them were ajar, some broken entirely, revealing rooms filled with shattered glass and rusted metal. There was something chilling about the place, something wrong. The deeper we went, the heavier the air seemed to grow, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something. Then we found the first room that made us all pause. It was the nurse's station, but it looked different from the rest. The desk was covered in a thick layer of dust, and yet the papers on it were still legible, almost as if someone had been there recently. A single, faded photograph of a woman in a nurse's uniform lay face down on the desk. We picked it up, and something caught my eye. Beneath the photo was a strange mark, almost like a handprint, burned into the wood. Suddenly, we heard a noise, soft at first, then louder. A door creaking open, followed by the unmistakable sound of shuffling footsteps. My heart leapt into my throat as I turned to the others. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Everyone nodded, their faces pale, eyes wide with fear. "Someone's here," whispered Sarah, her breath hitching. "Or something." We moved quietly toward the sound, our flashlights shaking in our hands. The noise was coming from the end of the hall, from the farthest room. It sounded like dragging, like something, or someone, was being pulled across the floor. The closer we got, the more the air seemed to thicken, the temperature dropping with every step. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, and it wasn't just from fear. There was a presence here, something dark and cold, watching us. We reached the door, and as Tom pushed it open, the flashlight flickered once, then went out completely. For a moment, everything was pitch black. "Great," muttered Mike, trying to turn the flashlight back on, but it wouldn't respond. We all stood there, holding our breath, the silence so absolute that it felt like the building was holding its own. Then, a whisper, soft at first, but growing louder. "Leave, leave, leave." I could feel my body go rigid with terror. I wasn't sure who was more afraid, the rest of us, or whatever was speaking to us. Then we heard it. A soft scraping, followed by a loud, wet thud, like something had fallen to the floor. A low growl, almost animal, reverberated through the room. Tom stumbled backward, his foot catching on something behind him. He fell to the floor with a loud crash, his flashlight rolling across the floor, illuminating the darkness for a brief moment. I saw something. Something moving in the shadows. It wasn't human, not entirely. I couldn't see its face, but I saw its shape, long limbs, twisted, crawling toward us. And then, a voice, not a whisper anymore, but a scream. "Run." We bolted. It wasn't a decision, it was instinct. We didn't look back, didn't stop to check who was behind us. We ran until we reached the front door, and even then, it was as if the building itself didn't want to let us go. The door wouldn't open at first, and we were all pulling, pushing, frantic. Finally, the door gave way, and we tumbled out into the cold night air. We never spoke about that night again. Some stories are better left untold. But I know what we saw. And I know that the asylum didn't want us to leave. Not all of us did. The rain had started to fall softly as I parked my car in the near-empty lot behind the building. It was late, and the city seemed to have swallowed all the sounds except the distant hum of traffic. I had a few more hours of work to get through before I could go home. A simple task, really, just another night checking the security footage, making sure everything was in order. But there was something about tonight that felt off, something in the air that I couldn't place. I stepped into the building, the familiar scent of stale coffee and worn carpet filling my nostrils. The fluorescent lights flickered above me as I walked down the hall, the faint buzz of electricity growing louder with each step. It was always quiet at this hour, too quiet. Just the rhythmic tap of my shoes against the tile floor. I reached the security office and sat down, flipping on the monitors. Nothing unusual yet. Just the steady flow of people moving through the building earlier in the day. The clock on the wall ticked by, its sound oddly loud in the silence. That's when I noticed it, a flicker on one of the screens. A shadow passing across the hallway, just outside the camera's reach. I frowned, replaying the footage, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty. Maybe I was just tired, my eyes playing tricks on me. But the feeling lingered, prickling at the back of my neck. I adjusted the screen, zooming in on the area where I had seen the movement. Again, nothing. A strange noise echoed from down the hall. It was soft at first, like footsteps, but slower, as if someone was dragging their feet. My heart skipped a beat. I stood up, walking cautiously toward the door. My breath was shallow, every nerve on edge. The building seemed to grow colder the further I walked. The hum of the lights above grew louder, almost oppressive. I rounded the corner, eyes scanning the darkness. Nothing. Just empty hallways, abandoned desks, and the occasional flicker of broken lights. But then I heard it again, footsteps. Closer this time. I turned, heart pounding, my pulse quickening as I realized I wasn't alone. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, and I froze. A figure, dark, indistinct, was moving toward me down the hallway. I couldn't make out any features, but the presence was undeniable. My breath caught in my throat as I instinctively stepped backward, but the hallway seemed longer than before, stretching out in front of me. I turned to run, but found my legs rooted to the spot. The air around me grew thick, suffocating. The footsteps echoed louder, closer. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. I stumbled backward, my hand reaching for the door behind me, but it wouldn't open. The lock was jammed. I spun around. The figure was mere feet away now, its form almost shifting, as if it didn't belong in the space. My mind raced, desperate for an explanation, but none came. The lights overhead flickered once more, plunging me into complete darkness. I held my breath, every muscle frozen in place, as the sound of breathing, slow, deliberate, filled the air. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. And then, the silence shattered. I felt something brush against my shoulder, cold and clammy. My breath hitched, and I jerked away, nearly colliding with the desk behind me. The lights flickered back to life, but the figure was gone. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, my mind spinning. The coldness in the air remained, and a whisper, soft, like a breath against my ear, lingered. I glanced back at the monitors. All of them showed nothing but the empty hallways. But I knew I wasn't alone. The evening mist hung low over the swamp, its thick tendrils curling around the trees like fingers, dragging the chill of the earth into the air. I had come to this place for answers about the strange disappearances that had plagued the village for years. People spoke in hushed tones about the swamp, the forgotten marshes beyond the old road. They said the bog was cursed, that something had awakened in the depths, but it was all nonsense, wasn't it? I had to find out for myself. The sky was darkening, casting a gray pall over the swamp. I could feel the weight of it in the pit of my stomach, an unsettling sense that the world was holding its breath. The thick undergrowth around me was silent, too silent. The soft squelch of my boots in the mud was the only sound, a reminder of how deep I had ventured into this forsaken place. I had a flashlight, its beam cutting through the growing gloom, but even the steady light felt fragile in the face of the swamp's ancient darkness. The trees here were gnarled, twisted shapes, their roots snaking out like fingers reaching for the ground. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, a faint, rotten scent that clung to the back of my throat. I shouldn't have come, but I had no choice. The people who had gone missing, had they been taken by the swamp, or was there something more to these stories? Something far darker? I pushed deeper into the marsh, the water now rising around my ankles, thick and heavy. The trees seemed to close in on me, their shadows stretching unnaturally long. My heart was pounding now, each beat like a hammer in my chest. And then I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from beneath the earth itself. I froze, the flashlight shaking in my hand. My breath caught in my throat. The sound wasn't quite human, too deep, too guttural. The air seemed to shift. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, a presence in the darkness, something huge, something waiting. I took a step back, my legs trembling, but the mud beneath me seemed to cling, pulling me in deeper. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but there was no explanation for what was happening. I turned, stumbling in the muck, desperate to flee, but the growl came again, louder this time, closer. The ground around me trembled, and I felt the unmistakable vibration of something massive moving beneath the surface of the swamp. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into complete darkness. I panicked, frantically trying to turn it back on, but it was useless. The cold, sticky air pressed on me, and the growl grew louder, almost deafening. And then I saw it, a flash of movement in the corner of my eye. Something massive, breaking through the fog. It was too fast, too large to be anything normal, and for a moment, I thought I was going to die right there, swallowed by the swamp. But I didn't. Instead, I felt something brush against my leg. Wet, clammy fingers. I screamed, pushing forward, my mind screaming at me to run, to escape, but the swamp was pulling me under, the water rising around my waist now. In the distance, the growl grew louder, closer. There was no escape. The thing was real. And it was coming for me. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the sound of something heavy splashing through the water, moving toward me with purpose. The pursuit. I never meant for it to go this far. The plan had been simple, just a quick break-in, a few valuables, and then disappear before anyone noticed. The house was isolated enough, out on the edge of town. No neighbors, no cameras. The perfect target. But as I stepped inside, my pulse quickened, not from excitement, but from something else. The house was unnervingly quiet, except for the faint hum of a refrigerator somewhere deeper inside. I had already gone through the living room and taken what I needed, a watch, some cash, a couple of rings. But while I was about to head for the kitchen, something stopped me. I heard a noise, barely a whisper, a sound coming from upstairs. A floorboard creaked. My heart skipped a beat. I wasn't alone. I hadn't planned for this. I moved quietly, my feet careful on the hardwood floor, heart pounding in my chest. I had to be smart. I had to leave before anyone realized what had happened. But as I moved through the hallway, I caught sight of a shadow passing by the top of the stairs. I froze. A woman's voice, called out, "Who's there?" I stood there, my breath caught in my throat, panic flooding through my veins. She had heard me. She had to have heard me. I couldn't run now. She was already awake, probably dialing the cops. I had no choice. I made a decision. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy metal lamp, and crept up the stairs. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I made my way toward the bedroom where I had seen the shadow. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I saw her. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hand trembling as she reached for her phone. It was too late. I had to act. I kicked the door open, and she gasped, falling back onto the bed, eyes wide in shock. I raised the lamp, ready to strike, but before I could, something changed. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a split second, I saw something I hadn't expected, something like understanding. Then, in an instant, she screamed. I ran. I bolted down the stairs, my heart thumping violently as I burst out the front door. I had no time to think, no time to plan. I just ran. I didn't even look back. But as I tore through the yard, I heard it, footsteps behind me, quick and heavy, gaining on me. She was chasing me. She wasn't calling the police. She was coming for me. My lungs burned as I pushed through the thick bushes, the cold night air stinging my skin. I could hear her behind me, the sound of her footsteps echoing louder, faster. How was she keeping up? I glanced over my shoulder, my breath ragged, and saw her, still running, closer now, her face twisted in something fierce, determined. The pursuit didn't stop. I dove into the alley, my mind racing. There was nowhere to hide. She was too fast, too relentless. My legs felt like they were made of lead, each step harder than the last. I could hear her breathing now, sharp and fast, just behind me, her footsteps echoing in the empty streets. Then, as I turned a corner, I heard it, a screeching sound, like something metal scraping against the pavement. The sound of something heavy, closing in. I stumbled and looked back, but she was gone. I stopped. The alley was empty. The footsteps had ceased. I caught my breath, but the relief didn't last long. Something felt wrong. She was still out there, watching, waiting. And then, from the darkness, I heard her voice, low and steady. You can run, but you'll never escape. The night walk. It was nearly midnight when I decided to take a walk. The city was unusually quiet, the hum of traffic silenced by the heavy fog rolling in from the river. I wasn't used to being out this late. Usually, I'd be at home, curled up with a book or scrolling through my phone, but tonight, something had drawn me out. Maybe it was the stillness, the way the streets seemed to stretch endlessly into the fog, or perhaps it was the feeling that something was waiting for me, something I couldn't quite explain. I stepped out of my apartment building, the cool air biting at my skin. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting an eerie glow on the damp pavement. The usual sounds of the city were missing, the distant car engines, the chatter of late-night pedestrians, even the hum of the neon signs. It was as if the city itself had fallen into a deep, unnatural sleep. I walked down the empty street, the only sounds being the soft rhythm of my footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. As I turned the corner onto an older street, the buildings here were taller, closer together, the narrow alleyways leading into shadows. The fog seemed thicker here, swirling around my ankles as I walked deeper into the unknown. At first, it was peaceful, almost calming. The quiet, the solitude, the cool breeze. But then, I heard it. A faint rustle, not from the wind, but from further down the street. My body tensed, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I stopped, trying to listen. The rustling was getting louder, closer. My heart began to race. Someone was out there. I glanced around, but the street was empty, the fog swallowing everything around me. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. There was no one here. No one except me. I started walking again, my pace quickening. The rustling stopped for a moment, but then came a soft, hurried footstep, almost like someone was following me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I glanced over my shoulder, but the street behind me was still empty. I couldn't see anyone, but I could feel it, feel the presence. Someone was out there. I broke into a jog, my feet pounding against the wet pavement. I turned another corner, hoping to lose whatever was following me, but the footsteps were still there, echoing mine. My pulse was racing now, my legs heavy with dread. I could hear them getting closer, the rhythm of their steps matching mine perfectly, as if they were right behind me. I dared another glance over my shoulder, but this time I saw it. A shadow, long and stretched out, moving along the edge of the fog. It wasn't human, at least not in the way I understood. The shape was wrong, its limbs too long, its head too large. I started running faster, the cold air burning in my lungs, the sound of my shoes hitting the ground deafening. My feet slipped on the wet pavement as I rounded another corner, but the shadow was still there, closing in on me. It was fast, unnaturally fast. Every time I looked back, it was closer. I could see the alleyway ahead of me, narrow, dark, a dead end. But I didn't care. I had to reach it, had to hide. I pushed myself harder, my heart hammering in my chest. Just as I reached the alley, I heard the softest whisper, like someone breathing right next to me. "Don't run." I skidded to a halt, my mind racing. There was nowhere to go now, nowhere to hide. The fog had swallowed me whole, the city lights now distant specks in the gloom. The shadow was right behind me, its breath cold against my neck. I turned slowly, my legs shaking. It was standing there, just out of reach, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze, heavy, suffocating, like it was seeing straight into me. The whisper came again, softer this time, like a sigh. "You can't leave." And then, the world went quiet. The ritual. We had come to the mountains for the weekend, eager to escape the city and immerse ourselves in the beauty of nature. The campground was nestled at the foot of a towering peak, surrounded by dense trees and a stillness that felt almost sacred. The air was crisp, the scent of pine filling our lungs as we set up our tents and gathered firewood. It was a quiet, peaceful place until we stumbled across the old stone circle. We hadn't planned on going that far. Our campsite was situated near a well-trodden trail, but curiosity had led us off the path and into the woods. And there it was, hidden among the trees, an ancient stone ring, its stones moss-covered and weathered by centuries of wind and rain. At first glance, it seemed like just a forgotten relic of the past, perhaps a marker from an old farming community or a long-abandoned settlement. But something about it didn't sit right. The air around the stone circle felt charged, as though the land itself was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to be there. "There's something off about this place," Mia said, her voice low as she stood next to one of the stones. She was the first to notice it, her eyes darting nervously around. "Look at this. This isn't just a random pile of rocks." I agreed, but it was too late. As we lingered, something about the place seemed to pull us in, as if it were calling to us. We stood there for a few more minutes, not saying much, just taking in the odd energy around us. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the last light faded from the sky, we made our way back to camp. The woods seemed darker now, the shadows stretching longer. It was as though the trees themselves were watching us. We made a fire and sat around it, trying to shake off the unease. But the feeling lingered. As the fire crackled, Marcus, the most adventurous of the group, suggested we try something. "Let's honor the old ways," he said with a grin. "A Scandinavian ritual, like they used to do in the old days. We've found the stones, might as well make it memorable." None of us were particularly religious, and none of us took it seriously, but something about Marcus's enthusiasm was infectious. We all agreed, if only to add a bit of thrill to the night. He told us the ritual was simple. We would stand inside the stone circle, each of us offering a small token, a pebble, a leaf, something symbolic, and we would say a few words in Old Norse. It was meant to honor the land, the spirits of the forest. At least, that's what Marcus had read. We walked back to the stone circle, the firelight from our camp dimming behind us. The fog had started to roll in, making the forest feel even more oppressive, the trees casting long, strange shadows across the ground. When we reached the stone ring, we stood in a circle, each of us holding a small object. Marcus went first. He placed a small stone in the center of the ring, then spoke softly in what I assumed was Old Norse. The words felt strange in the air, like an ancient echo reverberating through the ground beneath us. "Your turn," he said, smiling at us as he stepped back. One by one, we each stepped forward, adding our tokens to the center of the circle and reciting the words we had learned. There was a strange energy in the air, like the world itself was holding its breath, watching us. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and I wasn't the only one. Even Mia, who was usually the most skeptical, looked nervous. As the last person spoke, the ground beneath our feet trembled. It was subtle at first, just a slight vibration, but it grew stronger. The trees around us seemed to sway, even though there was no wind. A low, rumbling sound echoed in the distance, deep and guttural, like something waking up. We all froze, our eyes darting around the dark forest. Then, out of nowhere, a figure appeared at the edge of the stone circle. It was tall, its shape obscured by the mist that had rolled in. It was almost human, but there was something wrong about it, its limbs too long, its eyes too dark, like it was made of shadows and fog. I felt my heart race, my breath quickening. The others seemed to sense it too, a collective unease that spread like wildfire. Marcus was the first to move, backing away slowly, but the figure stepped forward, its presence overwhelming. And then, it spoke, though its voice wasn't human. It was a sound like the wind in a forgotten language, ancient and low, sending shivers down my spine. I couldn't understand what it was saying, but I felt it, the warning. The land was alive, and it wasn't pleased. Without thinking, I turned and ran. The others followed suit, our footsteps pounding on the ground as we bolted back toward camp. We didn't stop until we reached the fire, and even then, we didn't speak. The rest of the night was spent in silence, the weight of what we had done hanging heavily in the air. We didn't dare return to the stone circle, nor did we talk about the figure we had seen. The fog never lifted that night, and the oppressive stillness remained. We packed up and left first thing in the morning, not speaking a word about the ritual. We never spoke of it again. The visitors. It started like any other camping trip. My friends and I had planned it for months, weekend getaway, a chance to unplug and reconnect with nature. The weather was perfect, the skies clear, the stars just beginning to appear as we set up our tents by the edge of a quiet lake in the woods. The surrounding trees were dense, their branches swaying in a gentle breeze, and the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the occasional call of an owl. The kind of night that made you feel like nothing could possibly go wrong. We built a campfire, sat around it, and joked about everything and nothing. But as the fire crackled, a strange sense of unease began to settle in the back of my mind. It was nothing I could explain, just a quiet, gnawing feeling that something was different. I didn't say anything, and neither did anyone else. But I could tell, as the night wore on, that the others were starting to feel it too. There was a tension in the air, something off, but we couldn't put our fingers on it. And then it happened. I was the first to notice the lights. At first, I thought it was just a reflection of the stars on the surface of the lake, or maybe the glow from our fire playing tricks on my eyes. But as I looked up, I saw it clearly, a series of lights moving slowly across the sky. It was hard to describe at first. They weren't like stars, but they weren't like any aircraft I'd ever seen. They moved too fluidly, too deliberately. I stood up, squinting into the distance. "Hey, look at that," I said, pointing toward the lights. My friends followed my gaze. "What is that?" Mia asked, her voice uncertain. None of us could answer. The lights weren't making any noise, and they didn't look like planes or helicopters. They were too close together, too synchronized. They seemed to pulse with an eerie, steady glow, and then they stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then, as if they had been waiting for something, the lights shot off in different directions, fast, almost too fast to follow. My heart raced as I watched them streak across the sky, disappearing behind the trees. "What the hell was that?" Marcus said, his voice low and tense. We sat there in silence, the fire crackling softly between us, but none of us made a move. The peaceful night was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as though something had changed in the very air around us. Minutes passed, maybe longer, but the silence felt suffocating. Then, I noticed something in the distance, just beyond the tree line. A shadow. A figure, standing still in the dark. It wasn't human. I knew that instantly. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, and its movements were slow, deliberate. My breath caught in my throat. "Do you see that?" I whispered to Mia, who was sitting closest to me. She looked toward where I was pointing, her eyes widening as she caught sight of it. "What is that?" Before anyone could say anything else, the figure moved. It didn't walk, it glided. In a fluid motion, it seemed to float closer, the distance between it and us closing with terrifying speed. "Get back!" I shouted, standing up abruptly. "Get in the tents. Now!" We all scrambled to our feet, hearts pounding. Mia was the first to reach her tent, but the others were slower. I looked around, panic rising in my chest. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The figure was too close now, its features still indistinguishable in the dark, but there was something about the way it moved, it wasn't right. Suddenly, the sky lit up again, brighter this time, blindingly so. The lights we had seen earlier were back, but this time they were no longer in the sky. They were here, just above the treetops, hovering silently, casting strange, otherworldly shadows over the ground. I could hear the hum now, a low, vibrating sound that made my teeth ache. I turned to look at my friends, but none of them were looking at me. They were all staring at the figure, now standing just at the edge of the clearing, its shape more defined but still foreign, unnerving. And then, just like that, it vanished. 1 second, it was there, and the next, it was gone. The lights above us flickered once and then disappeared into the night, leaving only the thick silence behind. The strange hum was gone, too. We were left standing in the dark, shaking, our breath coming in sharp gasps. What the hell just happened? Mia whispered, her voice shaking. No one had an answer. We sat there, huddled together, for what felt like hours. The lights never returned, and the figure didn't reappear. Eventually, we mustered the courage to leave the safety of our tents, but the damage had been done. The sense of unease never left. We packed up as quickly as we could, barely speaking to each other, and left the campsite before the sun came up. We never talked about it again, not in detail. We'd seen something that wasn't human, something that didn't belong in the woods. But we didn't speak of it. Some things are better left unexplained. And to this day, whenever I look up at the stars, I wonder if they're still watching. The Butcher in the Woods. I had never been a fan of camping, but when a group of friends invited me on a weekend getaway to the forest, I felt it was time to face my unease. I wasn't a nature person, and the idea of spending the night in the woods, far from any sign of civilization, made me feel unsettled. But I convinced myself it would be fine, just a few days of fresh air and campfires, nothing more. The forest was dense, the trees towering overhead, blocking out most of the daylight as we set up our tents by a small clearing near a stream. The sun was low, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch on forever. The air smelled of earth and pine, and the rustling of leaves was the only sound. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful. That evening, as the fire crackled and we ate dinner, I started to feel a strange sense of being watched. Every now and then, I would glance into the dark woods, expecting to see someone, or something, lurking just beyond the tree line. I tried to shake the feeling off, but it lingered, growing stronger as the night wore on. Around midnight, when the fire had died down to embers, I decided to step away from the group for a bit. I wasn't tired, and I needed some time to myself. I grabbed my flashlight and walked into the woods, just beyond the clearing. The moon was barely visible, the trees thick and close together, and the air was colder, as though the forest itself had a bite to it. I wandered for what felt like only a few minutes, but soon I realized I had walked much farther than I intended. The trail had disappeared, and the trees seemed to close in around me. I stopped, my breath quickening. I had the distinct feeling I was no longer alone. A low sound reached my ears, a dragging, almost rhythmic noise, like something heavy being pulled through the underbrush. At first, I thought it was an animal. But the closer I got, the clearer the sound became, and I began to feel something more unsettling, the presence of someone who was not moving like an animal, but with deliberate, purposeful steps. I paused. My heart began to race, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The noise grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable, a series of heavy steps and the sound of something scraping against the ground. I didn't know why, but I instinctively turned around and began to move back toward the clearing. I wasn't running, but my steps were quick, my senses sharp. I hadn't taken more than a few steps when I caught a glimpse of movement in the distance, a figure emerging from between the trees. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its shape was obscured by the darkness, but the outline was clear enough. I froze. The figure stood still for a moment, then started walking toward me. Slow, deliberate steps, like it was toying with me. I stood there, my breath caught in my chest, unable to move. The only thing I could hear was the sound of its steps, dragging closer, then the scraping noise, like metal against stone. I took a step back, then another. But the figure kept advancing. The air felt heavier, colder. My hands began to shake, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. Finally, I turned and ran. I could hear it behind me now, the sound of heavy footsteps, the dragging scrape of something terrible scraping the earth. The flashlight bounced wildly in my hand, illuminating only fleeting glimpses of the trees and shadows. My feet stumbled over roots and uneven ground, but I didn't care. All I cared about was getting back to the clearing. When I burst out of the woods and into the camp, I could barely breathe. I ran to my friends, gasping, my mind racing. They looked at me, confused. "What's wrong?" Mia asked, her face lighting up with concern. I couldn't speak at first. I tried to explain what I had seen, but the words came out all wrong. I was shaking too hard, and the fear still had a grip on me. They laughed, thinking it was just nerves. "You're fine," Marcus said. "You probably just saw a bear or something." "It's the woods. Things get weird at night." But I knew what I had seen wasn't a bear. I couldn't sleep that night, no matter how hard I tried. Every little sound in the forest seemed amplified, every snap of a twig, every rustling leaf made my heart race. The others eventually fell asleep, but I stayed awake, staring at the dark outline of the trees, half expecting the figure to emerge again. As the night dragged on, I finally began to nod off, exhaustion catching up to me. That's when I heard it. The scraping sound again. It was faint at first, like something moving through the brush, distant. Then it grew louder. Closer. My eyes shot open, but I didn't move. The sound was unmistakable now, something dragging something heavy across the ground, like metal against stone. And then, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, growing closer. I heard the faintest whisper of a voice, low and guttural, carried on the wind. I didn't wait to find out who or what it was. I woke the others, and we packed up the camp as quickly as we could, leaving without a word. No one asked what happened. They could see the fear on my face. We didn't speak about it when we got back to town either. But I couldn't shake the image of that figure, the dragging, scraping sound it made, and the eerie feeling that we had disturbed something in those woods, something ancient and dark. The forest hadn't wanted us there, and it had made its warning clear. The depths below. The dive had been planned for months. My dive buddy, Liam, and I had been working our way through some of the most beautiful, remote dive sites along the coast, and the one we had just reached was no exception. We had heard whispers about this particular spot, deep, calm waters filled with vibrant marine life, an untouched paradise beneath the surface. But the deeper you go, the more you leave behind. We descended slowly, our dive lights cutting through the blue-black water like twin beams of sunlight. The deeper we went, the colder it became, and the silence was almost suffocating. All I could hear was the rhythmic sound of my own breathing and the occasional click of Liam's flashlight as we drifted further down. It felt peaceful at first, like we were entering a different world, where time didn't exist. We had reached about 100 feet when I first noticed it, a shadow, moving too quickly to be a school of fish. It didn't make sense at first. It was large, much larger than anything I'd ever seen before, but it wasn't shaped like anything familiar. It was a dark blur, just on the edge of my light's reach. My heart skipped a beat, and I looked at Liam, but he was too focused on adjusting his gear to notice. I hesitated, looking back at the shadow. It was gone now, but the unease lingered in my chest. I waved Liam over, and we gestured to each other with hand signals. There was something off about this place, something that gnawed at the back of my mind. But Liam was eager, pointing toward a rock formation that was supposed to be one of the highlights of the dive. So we moved on. We circled the rock structure, the visibility improving as we turned into a clearer area. But the shadow I'd seen earlier was still there, in the corner of my mind, and every time I glanced into the darker parts of the water, I expected to see it again. Something was watching us. And then it happened. Liam's flashlight suddenly flickered, his face turning pale behind his mask. I looked around in confusion, but it wasn't just his light that was malfunctioning. My own light began to dim, casting long, eerie shadows on the rocks and sand. A strange current swirled around us, the water churning for no reason. I had been diving long enough to know that currents don't just appear out of nowhere, especially not in waters this calm. Something was disturbing the flow. Liam grabbed my arm, and I could feel the panic rising in him. I didn't need to hear him to know that he had felt it too, the change in the water, the way it seemed to thicken, as if something massive was lurking just below us. Before I could react, I saw it again, the shadow, only this time it was much closer. And this time, it wasn't just a blur. Its form was undeniable. A massive creature, its body long and sinuous, moving with a terrifying grace through the water. It had no distinguishable fins or tail, but its shape was unmistakable, something that didn't belong to any ocean I knew. Its eyes were the most chilling part. They weren't the eyes of any fish, not even a predator. They were dark, empty, like endless voids that stared right through me. I tried to signal to Liam to ascend, but before I could even turn to him, the creature moved. It was fast, too fast. The water around us seemed to compress, and I felt a force pulling me downward, dragging me deeper into the abyss. Liam screamed into his regulator, but the sound was swallowed by the water. I kicked my legs frantically, trying to swim upwards, but every time I made progress, the pressure from below intensified. The creature wasn't just beneath us, it was everywhere, surrounding us, its presence suffocating. I couldn't see it clearly, but I could feel it, the weight of its movement in the water, the sense that it was toying with us. Liam was already too far ahead, and I could hear the desperate bubbles of his exhaled breaths. I couldn't keep up. I reached out toward him, but the creature's dark mass blocked my view. It was like the water itself was shifting in ways it shouldn't. I glanced down again, and this time I saw the outline of its mouth, huge, filled with rows of jagged teeth that glinted in the fading light of my flashlight. My heart slammed against my ribs as the creature's body coiled, a flash of motion too swift to comprehend. And then it stopped. Everything went still. The current stopped. The light from our flashlights flickered back to normal, casting an eerie calm over the scene. The creature was gone. We didn't waste another second. I grabbed Liam's arm and signaled for an immediate ascent, the panic rising in my chest as I kicked harder than I ever had before. My mind was a blur of thoughts, but the only thing I could focus on was getting to the surface, where the air was safe and the world made sense again. When we finally broke through the surface of the water, gasping for breath, the moonlight was our only comfort. The creature was gone, but I knew that what I had seen down there wasn't a figment of my imagination. I knew it was real. We didn't speak for the rest of the night. I don't know if Liam saw the same thing I did, but I knew we both felt the same sense of dread. We left the dive site early the next morning, leaving everything behind. The ocean is vast, and sometimes there are things in it that we aren't meant to understand. The Cursed Doll. I had always been fond of antiques, and when I walked into the dusty little shop in the corner of the street, I didn't think twice about it. The bell above the door jingled softly as I stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, faded leather, and the subtle hint of something I couldn't quite place. The shelves were lined with all kinds of forgotten treasures, framed paintings, tarnished silverware, fragile porcelain figurines. But it was the doll that caught my eye. She was small, no more than a foot tall, with delicate porcelain skin and hair made of fine, knotted yarn. Her eyes were dark, almost too dark, like pools of ink. The expression on her face was unsettling, too perfect, too still, as if she were waiting for something. Her tiny fingers were curled delicately, and her dress was an old-fashioned, lace-trimmed thing, as if she had just stepped out of a century ago. I couldn't help myself. Something about her seemed familiar. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with thin, gray hair, noticed my gaze. "Ah, I see you've found her," he said, his voice raspy, as though he had been waiting for me to notice. "She's an interesting piece. Not one many people are willing to buy." "Why not?" I asked, my curiosity piqued. "She's cursed," he said softly, as if saying it aloud would invoke something terrible. He lowered his voice further. "Some say she's been passed down through generations of families. Strange things happen around her, objects moved, whispers in the night, a feeling of being watched. No one who has kept her for long has ever been truly happy." I laughed nervously, dismissing his words as superstition. "It's just a doll. How bad can it be?" The old man's eyes seemed to darken, and for a moment I felt an icy chill creep up my spine. But it was too late. I had already picked her up, and the weight of her porcelain form felt strange in my hands, almost alive. I didn't know it then, but I had made a terrible mistake. That night, after bringing her home, I placed the doll on a shelf in my living room, her eyes staring blankly ahead. At first, everything seemed normal. I went about my evening, unpacking groceries and settling in for a quiet night. But when I passed by the shelf a little later, I felt a strange, inexplicable sensation, a cold shiver that crawled up my neck. The doll's eyes were no longer staring straight ahead. They were turned, as if following me. I froze. But no, this had to be a trick of the light. I shook my head, dismissing the feeling, and went on with my evening. But as the night went on, things began to change. Small things, at first. A glass I had left on the kitchen counter was moved to the edge, as if someone had touched it. The faint sound of scratching on the walls. The temperature in the room dropped, and I found myself shivering despite the heater running. The worst part was the whispers. They were faint at first, as if someone was speaking from far away. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, low, mocking, almost familiar. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the next day, things got worse. I woke up to find the doll on the floor, face down, as if someone had knocked it over in the night. The whispering was louder now, more urgent. I could hear it clearer, right next to my ear, as if the voice was inside my head. Put her back. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding. I had to get rid of the doll. I couldn't live like this. But when I tried to pick her up, something stopped me. The doll's cold, glassy eyes seemed to pierce through me, and I felt an overwhelming compulsion to return her to the shelf, to leave her exactly where she had been. I didn't want to, but I did. That night, I slept fitfully, waking up every few hours with the sensation that something was watching me. I'd hear the whispers, too. Sometimes, I'd catch a glimpse of the doll in the corner of my eye, and when I turned to look, she was in a slightly different position. I could feel her presence more strongly now, always there, always watching. A heavy weight pressed down on my chest as I tried to sleep, and I knew I was being haunted by something far worse than my imagination. The next day, I tried to leave the house, desperate to escape the suffocating atmosphere. But the whispers followed me, echoing in the corners of my mind. "She's waiting for you," they said. "You can't run from her." By the third night, I couldn't take it any longer. I packed a bag and left for a friend's house, abandoning the doll. But when I returned the next day, there she was, sitting on the shelf, staring at me as if nothing had changed. She had followed me. I tried everything to get rid of her. I buried her in the yard. I dropped her in the trash. I even gave her away to the antique shop. But no matter what I did, she always found her way back to me. There were rumors, I later learned, of the doll's past, stories of previous owners who had met untimely, violent ends. No one knew exactly what the curse was, but everyone agreed whoever took the doll would be trapped in its grip forever. I don't know how to break the curse. All I know is that I am never truly alone anymore. And no matter where I go, no matter how far I run, the doll is always there, waiting for me. The horror on the screen. It was just a typical Friday night when I decided to binge watch horror movies. My favorite thing to do after a long week of work was to crawl into my bed with the lights dimmed low, a bowl of popcorn by my side, and dive into a world of terror, one that I could easily escape from once the credits rolled. I didn't believe in supernatural things, ghosts, or demons. To me, it was all just fiction, stories designed to make your heart race and your skin crawl, but nothing more. I started with an old classic, a film I'd seen many times before. The kind of movie where you know the scares are coming, where the monster lurking in the shadows is a given. But even so, the tension always had a way of creeping up on you. It was about halfway through the movie when things began to feel off. I had just witnessed the main character stumble across a creepy, abandoned house in the middle of nowhere, the air thick with dread. A perfect setup for what was about to happen. But as the character turned a corner, my phone buzzed. Glancing at the screen, I saw a message from my friend, Mark. He'd sent me a voice memo, no words, just breathing. I furrowed my brow. It wasn't like him to send something so strange. I hit play. The first sound that came through was a low, labored breath, followed by what sounded like a creak of wood. And then, silence. I shivered, but shook it off. It was probably just Mark messing around. I turned my attention back to the film, but as the scene played out, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The tension in the movie was too real, too palpable. The house the character had entered looked all too familiar. The dark corners, the hallway stretching on forever, it looked like my own apartment. I blinked, confused, and paused the movie to take a breath. But as I did, I heard it, another sound. A faint scraping noise, like nails dragging across the floor. I turned my head, expecting to see nothing, but I felt it then, the presence of something in the room with me. My heart started to race. I shook my head and told myself it was just the atmosphere of the movie getting to me. But then, the noise came again, and this time it was unmistakable. It was coming from the hallway. I stood up, my legs trembling, and walked cautiously toward the door, my breath shallow. As I approached the dark hallway, I could barely make out the shape of something, a shadow moving in the corner. I froze, my chest tightening. There was no way I was imagining this. No way it was just a movie. I rushed back into the living room and slammed the door shut, heart pounding in my ears. My mind raced. I must be losing it. Maybe it was just the wind or the old pipes in the building creaking. But when I reached for the remote to start the movie again, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The movie had stopped, paused on the last frame. But behind the paused image, in the reflection of the television screen, I saw something. A figure. Standing in the hallway. It was tall and thin, with an almost skeletal frame, its eyes glowing white like a blank canvas. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't possible. It was just a reflection. Just a trick of the light. But the figure didn't move. It stood there, watching, its head tilted slightly to the side as if studying me. I turned away from the screen, my hands shaking. My mind raced, and I grabbed my phone to call Mark. No service. The signal was completely dead. Panic gripped me as I tried the door. It wouldn't budge. The lock was jammed, and the knob refused to turn. I felt the air grow heavy, colder, as if the room itself was closing in around me. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding. That's when I heard it again, the scraping. Closer this time, like it was right outside the door. My body froze, and I could feel my pulse in my throat, pounding harder with each passing second. And then, a knock. Soft at first, barely audible. But then louder, more insistent, as if someone, was trying to get in. The voice from the movie suddenly echoed in my head. Don't open the door. I stumbled back, my mind fighting to grasp what was happening. This wasn't a movie anymore. The boundaries between the screen and reality were dissolving. The horror that I had once watched in the safety of my home was now here. It was real. The door rattled again. This time, I heard a whisper, a low growl that seemed to come from the other side. You let it in, it said. I stepped back, my feet hitting the table behind me, knocking over the popcorn. The figure in the hallway was now at the edge of the door, its face just barely visible. I could feel its gaze on me, cold and hungry. I backed away from the door, but my legs gave way, and I collapsed on the floor, my mind racing. I didn't know how to stop this. How could I? The figure at the door began to move closer, its limbs jerking unnaturally, like it wasn't fully alive, like it was made of shadows and nightmares. It stepped over the threshold, and the air grew colder. The lights flickered as I scrambled to my feet, my body shaking with terror. I ran for the window, throwing it open and climbing out onto the fire escape. I didn't look back as I descended the stairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps. When I reached the ground, I didn't stop. I ran until I couldn't breathe anymore, until the night air felt like it could swallow me whole. I didn't return home that night. I don't think I ever will. The figure from the movie, the thing that was never supposed to cross into this world, followed me. It's still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to make a mistake again. Maybe one day, the scream will fade to black. But for now, it's far from over. The Black Cat. It started innocently enough, just a passing glance through the window one chilly autumn evening. I had been sitting in my living room, sipping a cup of tea and scrolling through my phone, when I noticed something strange outside. In the dim light of the street lamps, a black cat was sitting on the edge of my porch, staring directly at me. Its eyes were large, glowing faintly, like two lanterns in the night, and for some reason, I couldn't tear my gaze away from it. I shrugged it off. It was just a cat. There was nothing unusual about that. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was waiting for something, watching me with an intensity that felt almost deliberate. That night, I couldn't sleep. The cat's eyes lingered in my mind, flickering behind my eyelids whenever I closed them. I tossed and turned in bed, feeling the weight of an unease that I couldn't explain. The ticking of the clock in the hallway seemed louder in the silence, the house colder than usual. The next day, as I left for work, I noticed the cat again, sitting in the same spot, watching the house with its unblinking stare. This time, it followed me with its eyes as I walked down the driveway. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to shake it off. I couldn't afford to dwell on things that didn't make sense. But when I returned home that evening, the cat was still there. And this time, it wasn't just sitting, it was pacing slowly, back and forth, along the edge of my porch. Its movements were unnerving, deliberate. The air around me seemed to grow colder as it moved, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle in my chest. "Not again," I muttered, shaking my head. It had to be my imagination. But when I went inside, I locked the door behind me and double-checked the windows. I couldn't help it. Something about the cat made me feel like I wasn't alone. That night, I woke to the sound of scratching at the door. It was faint, almost like a whisper, but unmistakable. Slowly, I got out of bed and crept to the front door, my heart pounding. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was on the other side was desperate to get in. I opened the door just a crack, peering into the dark. Nothing. The porch was empty. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Suddenly, a flash of movement caught my eye. There it was again, the black cat. But this time, it was closer. It stood at the edge of the porch, staring at me with those same haunting eyes. It was only a few feet away, but it didn't make a sound. It didn't even blink. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped back, slamming the door shut. But the scratching persisted, louder now, as if someone was trying to claw its way inside. I backed away from the door, my heart racing. And then I heard it. A voice. A whisper, soft and distant, but unmistakable. "Let me in." My blood ran cold. I rushed to the window, pulling the curtain back just a sliver to see what was out there. The cat was still there, sitting motionless, staring directly at me, but now it was no longer alone. Behind it, in the shadows, I saw a figure, a dark, indistinct shape that seemed to loom just beyond the reach of the streetlight. I tried to turn away, but the voice came again, this time louder, more urgent. "Let me in. I've been waiting." The words echoed in my mind, growing louder and louder until they were deafening. I felt a pressure building in my chest, as if the very air around me was thick with dread. I reached for the phone, my hands shaking, but it was no use. The line was dead. The darkness outside pressed in, and I felt trapped in my own home. I turned back toward the window, and the figure was closer now. The cat was still there, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. I could feel its gaze piercing through me, as if it knew my every fear, my every secret. The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't a whisper at all. It was a voice, deep, raspy, and cold, like it was coming from the very pit of the earth. "Let me in, or you'll never be alone again." I stepped back, trembling, but the door wouldn't open. The locks wouldn't budge. The whispers were growing into a chorus, echoing through the house, louder and louder. The figure behind the cat moved closer, stepping into the light, and I saw it, a tall, thin shape, with hollow eyes and a face that was more shadow than substance. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The last thing I remembered before everything went black was the cat's eyes, those glowing, unblinking eyes, staring at me with a malevolent intensity. And the voice, soft and cold, repeating over and over, "Let me in." The curse of the donation. I had always dreamed of becoming a successful streamer. Ever since I first picked up a controller, I knew that streaming was more than just a hobby. It was my chance to connect with others, share my passion, and maybe even make a name for myself in the gaming world. The community, the thrill of live interactions, and the constant support from viewers were what kept me going, even through the roughest of times. It was a Friday evening when the donation came. I was in the middle of an intense match, my concentration broken only by the sound of a new alert popping up on the screen. The familiar ping echoed through my headphones, signaling a new donation. Nothing unusual there. Donations were a regular part of my streams, especially after a good match or a funny moment. But this one was different. The screen flashed with the username, BlackWolf99. The donation was large, far larger than any I've received before, and certainly enough to make my heart skip a beat. The message attached was simple, yet chilling. "I see you, keep playing." At first, I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just a fan, someone who had been following me for a while. I thanked the viewer, read the message aloud with a laugh, and kept going with the game. But the message lingered in the back of my mind, its cryptic tone unsettling me more than I wanted to admit. The next day, another donation came, and the day after that. Each donation was from the same account, BlackWolf99, each larger than the last, each message more ominous. "You're doing great, don't stop," one message read. Another simply said, "I'm watching." By the third day, I began to feel a growing sense of unease. The donations were no longer just about the money. They were becoming personal. It felt like this person was watching my every move, anticipating my next play, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Then, it happened. A fellow streamer, someone I knew from the community, posted on social media about something strange that had happened during their stream. They had received a donation from BlackWolf99, just like I had. But what was truly disturbing was what followed. As soon as the donation was made, the streamer had suddenly collapsed live on stream, unconscious. No one knew what had happened. There was no sign of foul play, no medical explanation. It was as if something had drained all of their energy in an instant. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The connection was clear. Black Wolf 99 wasn't just a fan, it was something more. Something darker. The next week, another streamer in the community met a similar fate. This time, they were found dead in their apartment, their face twisted in horror as if they had seen something none of us could understand. The police ruled it an accidental death, overdose, they said. But those who knew the truth whispered about the donations, about Black Wolf 99. That's when the fear set in. I began to dread every stream. I knew the donations would keep coming, and with them, a strange sense of dread would follow. The messages grew more unsettling. "You're next," one of them said. "Don't ignore me." One night, as I was streaming a new game, I felt it. That familiar ping of a donation, but this time, my hands went cold. My heart thudded in my chest as I saw the familiar username pop up again. Black Wolf 99. I hesitated, but I opened the message. It was a simple phrase, "I'm closer than you think." My webcam flickered, the screen glitching for a moment, and I felt the air around me grow heavy. I laughed it off, thinking it was just a technical glitch, but deep down, I could feel something was wrong. I glanced around my room, half expecting to see someone standing behind me. But no one was there. The next day, my worst fear came true. I woke up to a barrage of messages from viewers, all concerned. They said my stream had been interrupted in the middle of the night, that they had seen me collapse on camera, just like the others. My heart raced. I had no memory of it. The last thing I remembered was streaming the game. Then, nothing. But as I looked through the footage, the horrifying truth became clear. Midstream, my face had gone pale. My hands shook uncontrollably. I had collapsed in front of the camera, my body twitching as if something was draining the life out of me. But the worst part was the figure in the corner of the screen, a shadow, darker than the room itself, barely visible but unmistakable. I checked the donation logs. Black Wolf 99 had donated again, but the message this time was clear, "One more in your mind." The next day, I saw another streamer in the community had died, this time on a live broadcast. They hadn't collapsed. They hadn't twitched. They had simply disappeared. Vanished without a trace, leaving their camera running, their chat flooded with questions, their audience paralyzed in confusion and fear. It was then that I realized what was happening. Each donation from Black Wolf 99 wasn't just a gift, it was a curse. A curse that would take the streamer's life once it had been accepted, once the message had been read aloud. It wasn't just about the money. It was a game. A twisted, deadly game where the stakes were your life. I couldn't run from it. I couldn't escape it. As I prepared for the next stream, the donation sound echoed in my ears, louder than ever. The chat was already buzzing with anticipation. And then it came. Black Wolf 99 had sent another donation. I stared at the screen, trembling. The message was simple. "You're next." The lights in my room flickered once more, and I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. It was over. The radiation meteor. The evening started off like any other. I had spent the entire day hiking through the mountains, escaping the noise of the city to enjoy a bit of peace. The air was crisp, and the sky was a clear blue, perfect for stargazing later that night. I had found a small campsite by a creek, far enough from any roads that I would have the solitude I craved. The fire crackled as I sat back, staring at the flames, content. As darkness descended, I unpacked my telescope and set it up, excited to finally catch a glimpse of the stars above. The night sky in the mountains was breathtaking, so many constellations, so much depth. I pointed the telescope towards the sky and adjusted the lens, letting my eyes adjust to the brilliance of the universe. It was when I looked through the telescope that something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but no, there was something in the sky, something moving fast. A streak of bright white, too bright to be a satellite or a plane. It shot across the horizon with a speed that sent a chill down my spine. I watched, entranced, as it grew larger and brighter. My heart raced. And then it hit the earth. There was no explosion. No fireball. It was a strange, silent crash, like a distant, thunderous rumble under the earth's skin. For a moment, I thought it was my imagination. The wind had picked up, rustling the trees and the leaves around me. But something was different. The air felt heavy. Electric. I grabbed my flashlight and ran toward the impact site, my feet stumbling over rocks and roots. The distance wasn't far, maybe a quarter of a mile, but I had never run so fast in my life. The excitement mixed with something else, an unexplainable, gnawing feeling that something was terribly wrong. As I reached the clearing, I saw it. The meteorite was small, no larger than a basketball, but it was glowing faintly, a pale, sickly green. There was a faint hum in the air around it, like the vibration of an unseen force. The ground around it was scorched, as if the heat from the meteor had left a permanent mark on the earth. I cautiously approached, my flashlight trembling in my hand. As I got closer, I felt it, something was wrong. The air itself seemed to shimmer, distorted, like heat rising off the pavement on a summer day. I noticed something strange about the grass around the meteorite. It was wilting, turning brown and brittle, as if the very presence of the object was draining the life from the land. I knelt down, shining my light on the rock. It had an unnatural sheen, unlike any stone I had ever seen before. I reached out, my fingers brushing the surface. The instant my skin made contact, a sharp pain shot through my hand, as if I had touched something burning. I jerked back, shaking my hand as if to shake off the heat, but it lingered, a tingling sensation that spread up my arm into my chest. Suddenly, I felt dizzy. My vision blurred, and the sound of my heartbeat filled my ears, growing louder with each passing second. The hum in the air intensified, vibrating my bones. My body felt as though it was being pulled toward the rock, as if it had a magnetic force. I stumbled backward, gasping for air, but the dizziness only worsened. The world around me began to distort. I ran. I didn't know why or how, but I knew I had to get away from the meteorite. My body felt heavier, the ground beneath me shifting as if the world itself was bending. My stomach churned, and I could taste something bitter in the back of my throat. I didn't know what was happening, but I had to escape. I made it back to my campsite, collapsing by the fire, gasping for breath. My skin burned, and my heart raced in my chest. I tried to steady myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That something inside me had shifted. The next morning, I woke up feeling weak. My head ached, and I couldn't stop shaking. The world around me felt different. The trees, the mountains, everything looked off kilter. The sky was dull, an unnatural shade of gray. The air smelled faintly of metal and something acrid, like burnt plastic. I checked the spot where the meteorite had landed, but it was gone. There was no sign of the strange glowing rock, just a deep, scorched crater in the ground. The plants surrounding it were dead, withered away. It was as if the meteorite had never been there at all. I returned to the city the next day, my mind racing. But as the days went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with me. My health deteriorated rapidly, my skin started to peel in places, my eyes grew sensitive to light, and I began to cough up strange, metallic-tasting mucus. It was as if the meteor's radiation had seeped into my body, altering it, changing me. I went to the doctor, but they couldn't find anything wrong. All of my tests came back normal, but I knew the truth. Something had happened that night, something I couldn't explain. I had touched the meteorite, and now I was paying the price. Weeks passed, and the symptoms grew worse. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat without feeling nauseous. My bones ached constantly, and my vision began to blur. My hair fell out in clumps. I wasn't the only one. Other hikers who had been nearby that night began to report similar symptoms: headaches, dizziness, nausea. Some of them disappeared completely, leaving no trace behind. The meteorite had released something into the environment, radiation, or something far worse. And now, it was too late to stop it. As I looked into the mirror one final time, my reflection didn't look like me. My skin was mottled and pale, my eyes sunken and hollow. I had become a part of the meteor's curse, just another casualty of something that should have never touched this earth. And I knew then it wasn't over. The beast of the forest. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend getaway, just me, my backpack, and the quiet solitude of the northern woods. I had been planning this trip for months, a chance to escape the grind of city life and find peace in nature. The forest, dense with towering pines and thick underbrush, was known for its beauty and its calm. It had always been a place I dreamed of visiting. I arrived at the trailhead just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. The hike up was easier than I expected, the path clear and winding through the trees, leading me to a small, secluded cabin I had rented for the weekend. The cabin was old, but sturdy, nestled near the edge of the forest, far enough from the nearest neighbor to make me feel alone, but not so far as to be unreachable in an emergency. By the time I settled in and started a small fire inside the cabin, the night had fully fallen. The forest outside was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. I felt a sense of peace settle over me as I poured myself a cup of tea, listening to the crackling wood and the soft breeze outside. But then, something shifted. At first, it was just a noise, a strange rustling in the underbrush, too loud to be just a squirrel. I froze, my hand stilling on the cup as I listened intently. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by a deep, throaty grunt. A bear, I thought. There were rumors of them in the area, but they were rare. Still, I knew I had to be cautious. I stood, quietly moving toward the small window to get a better look. There, just beyond the tree line, I saw it. A massive shape moved between the shadows, its fur dark and matted. Its head was low, nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. I could hear its deep, heavy breaths, the rhythmic pounding of its paws against the earth. It was big, too big to be just a regular bear. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced. I had read about bears becoming aggressive when they felt threatened, but this felt different. This felt deliberate. The bear didn't seem interested in the food I had left outside. It was focused on me, on the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped toward the door, my mind racing. I needed to get out of there, I thought. I needed to call for help. But as I reached for my phone, I noticed the signal had dropped. No bars. No service. Panic surged in my chest. I turned back toward the window, but the bear was gone. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Maybe it had just been passing through. Maybe I was overreacting. But then, I heard the unmistakable sound of something heavy crashing against the cabin wall. The bear had come closer. My heart skipped a beat, and before I could think, I rushed to the back door and bolted it shut, my hands trembling. I glanced out through the small window at the back of the cabin, trying to see if the bear had left, but all I could see was the darkness of the forest. Then the growl came. It was low, guttural, like something from the depths of the earth. It echoed through the trees, vibrating in my chest, and I realized it wasn't just a bear. It was something worse. Something angrier. The door shuddered again, and this time I saw the claws. Long, sharp, and jagged, they scraped against the wood like nails on a chalkboard. The force behind them was immense, enough to rattle the entire cabin. I ran to the window and watched as the bear, or whatever it was, circled the cabin, its massive body blocking the moonlight. The growls grew louder, more frantic, and I could feel the animal's rage, its desire to get inside. It wasn't hungry, it wasn't after food. It was after me. I grabbed my backpack, stuffing it with whatever I could find, my phone, a flashlight, some snacks, anything. My mind raced, trying to think of an escape, but the window wouldn't be big enough to climb through, and the front door was no match for the creature outside. I knew I couldn't stay in the cabin. Not with it out there. Suddenly, there was silence. The growls stopped. The claws stopped scraping. The forest seemed to hold its breath, and for a moment, I thought it was over. But then, a loud thud, so heavy, so forceful, that it shook the entire cabin. The bear had slammed itself into the wall, causing the cabin to creak under the impact. It was coming. I had no choice. I shoved open the back door and ran into the forest. The cold air bit at my skin, but I didn't care. I pushed forward, stumbling over rocks and roots, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly in front of me. The sounds of the bear followed, crashing through the underbrush, its steps heavy and fast. It was closing in. My breath was ragged, my legs burning as I sprinted through the trees, desperate to put distance between myself and the monster behind me. But it was no use. The growls were closer now, so close that I could feel the ground shake with each heavy footfall. I twisted through the trees, my mind swimming with fear, when I suddenly saw a faint light through the forest. It was a cabin, just like mine, and I could see a silhouette in the window. Someone else was out here. I screamed for help, but the growl was louder, drowning out my voice. I could feel the air grow heavier, the presence of the beast pressing down on me. I was about to give up when I heard a shout. Someone was coming toward me. But before I could reach them, something large, heavy, and warm slammed into my side. The force knocked me off my feet, sending me sprawling into the dirt. I turned, eyes wide with terror, and saw the massive bear, its face twisted into a snarl, its eyes wild with fury. It was too late. The shadow that hunts. It started with a strange feeling. A feeling that something was always just behind me, lurking in the corner of my vision, but when I turned, there was nothing there. I didn't think much of it at first. Everyone feels like that sometimes, right? The idea of shadows moving on their own is the stuff of bad horror movies. But this wasn't a movie. This was real. I had recently moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, hoping for a fresh start. The walls were thin, the floors creaked, and the neighborhood was quiet, maybe too quiet. I liked it, though. It was peaceful. At least, it was supposed to be. The first few nights were uneventful. I unpacked my things, set up my bed by the window to let the soft streetlight filter in at night. But as the nights grew longer, I began to notice something odd. It wasn't the usual creaks of an old building. It wasn't even the flickering lights. It was my own shadow. It would move differently. I would be sitting on the couch, the TV buzzing in the background, and I'd glance over only to see my shadow doing something it shouldn't. It would stretch unnaturally long, twisting in ways it shouldn't. Sometimes it looked like it was shifting, as if it had a life of its own. At first, I thought I was just tired, that I was imagining things. But the longer I stayed up, the worse it got. I tried to ignore it. But then things started happening that I couldn't explain. I would wake up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding, and the apartment would be dark, except for the faint light spilling in from the street. My shadow would be there, cast against the wall, darker than it should have been, more defined. And it wouldn't be mine. I would lie there, frozen, watching as the shadow slowly moved, stretching across the floor like it had a mind of its own. It would reach for me, crawling toward my bed as if it knew exactly where I was. The first time it happened, I thought it was just a nightmare, that I had been dreaming. But the second time it happened, I was awake. And it was real. I could feel it now, the weight of it in the room. A presence, cold and heavy, like something was watching me. My eyes would lock on the shadow, my pulse racing. It would stretch across the room, its form twisting and shifting like it was trying to reach me. I could hear it, too, faint scratching noises, like claws against the wood. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront it. I turned on all the lights in the apartment, hoping the brightness would stop it from coming closer. I watched my own shadow shift and bend in the light, moving like it was trying to break free from the wall. I was terrified, but I needed to know what was happening. That's when it spoke. Not in words, but in a way I could feel. A sharp, sickening pressure in my chest, like a vice squeezing my heart. I couldn't breathe. The shadow on the wall seemed to stretch further until it covered the entire room. It was moving now, no longer confined to the wall, and it was reaching for me. My body trembled as I backed away, but the more I moved, the more it followed, its shape warping in the corner of my vision. It was alive. I knew that now. It wasn't a trick of the light or a play on my tired mind. There was something in the shadows, something that wanted me. I ran. I stumbled toward the door, fumbling for the handle, but it was too late. The shadow was already there, its cold fingers brushing against my neck, pulling me back into the dark. I screamed, but the sound was muffled, as if the very air had been swallowed by the darkness. The apartment seemed to close in on me, the walls narrowing as the shadow tightened its grip. My heart pounded, my breath shallow and quick as I fought to break free. But the more I struggled, the more it squeezed, its dark tendrils wrapping around my body like chains. I could feel it now, its hunger, its rage, its desire to take me. It wasn't just watching me anymore. It was trying to kill me. I managed to break free for a moment, the shadow recoiling as I ran toward the door. But it was relentless. It was faster than I was, and as I opened the door to escape, the last thing I saw was the shadow, growing larger, darker, filling the doorway. The last thing I felt was the cold grip of it closing around my throat. The next morning, the apartment was quiet. The sun filtered through the blinds, casting long, innocent shadows across the floor. But I was gone. No sign of struggle. No clue where I had gone. My neighbors reported hearing nothing, seeing nothing, except for the shadow. The one that moved without me. The words that should never be spoken. I had always been a curious person, especially when it came to the old stories and superstitions that filled the quiet, dusty corners of my town. There was a local myth, passed down through generations, that certain words, uttered in the wrong context, could summon something unspeakable. No one dared speak them, not out loud, not even in a whisper. I had heard these stories countless times as a child. My grandmother would speak of them in hushed tones, her eyes darting nervously as she warned me. Some words, she would say, are better left unspoken. Some things are not meant to be called. But like many children, I grew up thinking it was just a tale to frighten the young, a way for adults to keep their children in line. I never believed. Not really. Not until the day I discovered the old book in the attic. The book was hidden beneath a pile of forgotten belongings, wrapped in a faded cloth that smelled faintly of must and decay. I found it one evening while looking for a box of old holiday decorations. It looked ancient, its leather cover cracked with age, and when I opened it, I was immediately struck by the strange symbols written inside. There was something unsettling about it, but I couldn't stop reading. The pages seemed to pull me in, as if the words were alive, whispering to me in a language I didn't understand. But there, written clearly in English, was a list. A list of words. Words I had never seen before, yet something about them felt so familiar. There were only a handful, but they felt wrong. The kind of wrong that makes your skin crawl. I recognized some of them from the old stories my grandmother used to tell, but these were more than just names or old curses, they were instructions. Instructions on how to call something. Something terrible. The text warned, never say these words aloud. Never, under any circumstances. The rules were clear, these words, when spoken, would open doors that were never meant to be opened. Doors to places where darkness lived. Places where people were forgotten, where souls were taken. Each word had a specific time, a specific place, and a specific person to whom it must never be spoken. I knew, without a doubt, that something unimaginable would happen if they were ever uttered. I should have closed the book and forgotten about it. I should have left the attic and never looked back. But the temptation was too great. The fear was too powerful. I had to know. And so, I did what I swore I never would. I whispered the first word. At first, nothing happened. The room stayed the same, silent, still, bathed in the soft glow of the fading afternoon light. I felt foolish. Ridiculous. But as the silence stretched on, an uneasy feeling began to settle in my chest. It wasn't that anything was different, it was that nothing felt different. The air felt too still, too heavy, like it was holding its breath. And then I heard it. A faint scratching noise, almost like nails dragging across wood, coming from the dark corner of the room. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The sound grew louder, more frantic, until it was unmistakable. It wasn't coming from the corner, it was coming from the walls. I backed away, heart hammering in my chest. The book slipped from my hands and hit the floor with a thud. And that's when I saw it. A shadow, deep and unnatural, moving across the wall. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as it shifted, I realized it was something more. The shape moved with purpose, not a mere trick of the eye. It was something alive, something watching. The air grew cold, unbearably cold, and I could see my breath now. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. My throat was dry, as if something was blocking the sound, stopping me from calling for help. The shadow on the wall stretched, twisting and writhing like it was trying to escape its confines. Then it stopped. It turned. And for a brief moment, our eyes met. I saw something there, something dark and ancient, something that shouldn't exist in this world. It was a presence, a consciousness, staring back at me with an endless, hollow gaze. It was aware of me. It was waiting. I stumbled back, knocking over the chair behind me, and I heard it, the low, guttural voice. It wasn't mine. It wasn't even human. You shouldn't have spoken. The words echoed in my mind, rattling my thoughts, and I realized it wasn't just one word. It was a chain. Once the first word had been spoken, the door had been cracked open. And now, it was coming. I ran for the door, but the room felt different now. It was wrong. The walls seemed to stretch and bend, the windows turning to dark, endless voids. I couldn't escape. The darkness was everywhere. I can't remember how long I wandered through that endless space, trapped in a world that no longer felt real. I couldn't hear anything except the pulse of my own blood pounding in my ears. My heart felt as though it might break through my chest at any moment. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I woke up on the floor of the attic, the book beside me, the shadows long gone. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But I knew better. I could still feel it, that weight, that presence, lingering in the air, just beyond reach. I knew it was only a matter of time before the shadow returned. And I knew, too, that it would never forget. It never forgets. There are words you should never speak. Words that should never leave your lips. Words that will open doors to a darkness that will hunt you, and it will never stop. The Children Who Changed. It was a warm September afternoon when the first child disappeared. At least, that's what we thought at first. Oliver Thompson, a quiet 10-year-old with wide, innocent eyes, vanished without a trace. His mother said he'd been playing outside, riding his bike down the street, but by the time she called him for dinner, he was gone. The police searched everywhere, but there was no sign of him. No footprints. No clues. Just empty streets, swaying trees, and an eerie quiet that blanketed the town. It wasn't until a few days later, when another child, Mia Calloway, went missing under similar circumstances, that we started to feel the shift. The town, known for its peace and predictability, suddenly seemed off. People kept whispering in hushed voices. The air felt thick with unspoken questions, but no one dared to ask. Then, one by one, the children started to return. But they weren't the same. Oliver was the first. He came back a week later, standing at the edge of his yard at dawn, his eyes wide and empty, his expression blank. His mother rushed to him, tears streaming down her face, but Oliver didn't speak. He didn't hug her or even acknowledge her. He just stood there, staring at the ground, like a mannequin stuck in the wrong place. At first, the adults tried to shake it off. "He's just in shock," they said. "It'll pass." But when Mia returned a few days later, just as silent, just as still, it became impossible to ignore. She too stood at the edge of her front lawn, staring into the distance, her parents frozen in place, unsure of what to do. Soon, more children came back. Sam, Lucy, Eli, and others, each one more vacant than the last. It was as if they were all copies of the same blank slate. They moved, they ate, they slept, but they never spoke. They never smiled. They never looked anyone in the eye. Then came the whispers, the ones I heard from Mrs. Simmons, who worked at the diner. She told me that one night, when she was walking home, she had seen the children standing together in the middle of the street at midnight. They were facing the same direction, unblinking, as if watching something we couldn't see. She said she heard their voices, low and almost melodic, chanting something. It sounded like a song, but the words were wrong. They didn't belong to any language she knew. I didn't want to believe her. But when I saw them for myself, standing at the town square, their heads all turned toward the old church on the hill, I felt a cold chill creep down my spine. I'd seen them gather there before, in ones and twos, but never all at once. And the look in their eyes, it was like they were waiting for something. Something was happening to the children. They weren't just silent, they were different. It wasn't just their behavior. It was in their eyes, empty, unblinking, as though they were seeing things the rest of us couldn't. They seemed to move in sync, as though someone, something, was guiding them. And their presence, once an innocent joy, now sent a shiver down my spine. The town, once full of the sounds of children laughing, was now eerily quiet. The parks were empty. The schoolyard, where kids used to run and shout, was silent. It wasn't until I saw Emma Richards, my own niece, that I truly understood what was happening. She was the last to come back. At first, I didn't recognize her. Her eyes, once bright and full of mischief, were now cold, devoid of warmth. She was standing in the middle of the street, her hands hanging limp by her sides, as if she was waiting for someone or something to come to her. I called her name, but she didn't respond. I ran to her, shaking her gently, but she only blinked once, slowly, and looked at me. Her lips barely moved as she whispered something, a name, her voice a hollow echo that sent goosebumps up my arms. We are waiting. The words hit me like a slap. Waiting for what? I asked, but she didn't answer. Instead, she turned, her gaze locking onto something in the distance. Something I couldn't see. The others began to gather around her, appearing from every corner of the town like shadows, each one staring at the same spot, their heads moving in unison. I could feel the air growing thick around us. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. They were waiting, but they weren't waiting for anything I could comprehend. It wasn't long before the first adult spoke up. It was Sheriff Peterson, his face pale and tight with fear. He had seen it too, the way the children moved as if controlled by an unseen force. He gathered the town together, urging us to stay indoors, to lock our doors, to keep our children close. But it was already too late. The children were no longer children. They were something else, something that didn't belong in our world. And every day, the number of children gathered at the edge of the woods, near the church, or along the riverbank, grew. They stood in eerie silence, waiting. Then, one evening, without warning, they all vanished. As suddenly as they had come, they were gone. The town was left in a hollow, unsettling silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind. I looked at the empty streets, the abandoned playgrounds, the silent houses, and I realized that whatever had happened to them whatever had taken them, it wasn't over. It was only beginning. The skeletons in the cemetery. It was late autumn, and the chill in the air had already begun to feel permanent. The days were short, and the fog rolled in thicker with each passing night, turning everything into a murky blur. I had been walking through the cemetery every evening for the past few days, passing the rows of old tombstones and weathered statues, my footsteps the only sound in the cold quiet. I wasn't sure why I had chosen this path. Perhaps it was the pull of the forgotten, the allure of the past, or just the need for solitude. The cemetery had always been an eerie place, but that particular week it felt more unsettling than usual. I had noticed something odd the day before. A grave that I could have sworn hadn't been there the previous day, a fresh mound of dirt just next to the older stones. It wasn't a grave I recognized. The headstone was simple, with no markings, just a blank, weather-beaten slab. I remember standing there for a moment, puzzled, feeling a slight shiver creep up my spine. But the next day, well, that was when it all started to change. It had rained earlier, and the ground was soft, the earth slick underfoot. As I wandered deeper into the cemetery, I couldn't help but notice that the air seemed even colder, the fog thicker. It wasn't just the weather. It felt as though something was shifting beneath me, as if the ground itself were watching, waiting. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing near the fresh grave. At first, I thought it was just the fog playing tricks on my eyes, but as I got closer, I could see clearly. A man, or at least, what had once been a man. His body was a tangle of broken bones and rotting flesh, his arms raised as if in a silent plea. His face, if it could even be called that, was nothing more than a skull, hollow and jagged, its eye sockets empty but somehow still looking at me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. My instinct was to turn and run, but my feet were rooted to the spot, as though the earth itself had claimed me. The figure didn't move, just stood there in the dim light, an unnatural stillness in the air. I looked around, hoping to see another person, maybe someone who could explain this, anything to convince me this was some strange hallucination or prank. But no one else was around. The cemetery was silent, save for the distant rustling of leaves. Then I heard it. A sound, low and guttural, rising from the depths of the grave. It was a scraping, grinding noise, like bones moving over stones. The ground trembled slightly beneath my feet, and I watched in horror as the earth around the grave began to shift. The mound of dirt near the headstone cracked open, and slowly, something emerged from within. It was a skeleton, its bones bleached white, its form unnaturally intact, as if it had just risen from its resting place. The thing stood up with a creaking sound, its joints stiff and brittle, but there was an unmistakable sense of purpose in its movements. It wasn't just an ordinary skeleton, there was something wrong about it. The empty sockets of its skull were filled with an eerie, dim light that pulsed in time with the distant sounds of the wind. I backed away, my breath caught in my throat, my eyes unable to look away. The first figure, the one I had seen moments before, was now joined by another, then another, until the entire cemetery seemed to be alive with motion. Skeletons were emerging from graves, climbing from the earth as though they had never truly rested. Their bones scraped against the stone, their hollow eyes glowing with a dark, malevolent energy. I wanted to scream, but my voice was trapped in my chest, my mind racing to understand what was happening. What had disturbed their rest? Why now, after all these years, were they rising? The skeletons moved in silence, their limbs jerking awkwardly, as though they hadn't used them in centuries. They seemed to glide across the cemetery, slowly, deliberately, their eyes scanning the air, the ground, the gravestones. They were searching for something, or someone. I turned, finally finding the strength to run, but as I did, I felt an icy hand on my shoulder. I spun around, expecting to see the skeletal figure that had first risen, but instead, I saw only darkness. The cemetery was now a maze of shadows, the fog so thick that I could barely see my own hands in front of my face. I heard the sounds of footsteps behind me, clattering, dragging sounds, as though a dozen bones were scraping against the stone, following me through the cemetery. I ran faster, but no matter how quickly I moved, the noise only grew louder. The figures were drawing closer. They were relentless. In the distance, I could see the cemetery gate. It was so close, yet it felt impossibly far away. The skeletons were moving with a strange purpose now, their heads turning toward me, their hollow eyes tracking my every move. I reached the gate, but as I tried to push it open, I realized with a sickening lurch that it wouldn't budge. The latch was stuck, rusted in place. I turned around to see the skeletons closing in, their bony hands reaching out. The first one who had risen was leading the others, its eyes glowing brighter with each step, its grin widening into something unnatural. I knew then that there was no escaping them. They weren't just mindless creatures, they were ancient, bound to the earth, and I had unknowingly awakened them. I felt a cold hand reach out and grab my ankle, pulling me down to the ground. The last thing I saw was the hollow-eyed gaze of the lead skeleton, its bony fingers tightening around my throat as the rest closed in. The next morning, the cemetery was quiet again. The fog had cleared, and the sun peeked through the clouds, casting a soft light over the graves. There was no sign of what had happened the night before. No sign of the skeletons, no trace of the destruction they had left behind. Only the fresh grave remained, the one with the blank headstone, and the silence that followed. The plane that couldn't land. It was supposed to be a routine flight. Just another one of those evenings where the hum of the plane, the soft buzz of the overhead lights, and the rhythmic sounds of the engines would lull me into a quiet half-sleep. But that night, nothing went as planned. I was sitting by the window, looking out at the stretch of dark sky, the occasional flash of city lights far below. The flight was mostly smooth, and the crew was calm, moving efficiently through the cabin. I couldn't have known that by the time we would be making our descent, the calm would turn into something far worse. It started as a minor glitch, nothing alarming at first. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, asking the cabin crew to prepare for landing. We were approaching our destination, and everything seemed to be going smoothly. I could see the lights of the airport in the distance, tiny specks growing larger as we descended through the clouds. But then, something strange happened. The plane didn't lower as expected. The descent slowed, then stopped altogether, as if the plane were suspended in midair, held up by an invisible force. The engines made a strange whistling sound, and the captain's voice came back on, now tinged with a nervous edge. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain seated and stay calm. We're working on it." I glanced around the cabin, noticing the growing tension in the faces of the other passengers. The flight attendants, usually composed, were exchanging glances, their smiles now stiff and uncertain. The momentary calm that had filled the cabin seemed to be evaporating, replaced by something that felt wrong. We hovered for minutes. Then, it seemed hours. The plane remained stationary in the sky, as if it had become caught in some strange limbo. I could hear the hum of the engines, but there was no movement. No downward motion, no forward motion, nothing. Just a suspended stillness that felt utterly unnatural. I looked out the window again. The lights of the airport were still visible, but now they seemed farther away, as if the plane had somehow drifted off course. I strained my eyes to see if there were other planes around us, but all I saw was an endless expanse of dark sky. We weren't moving. Not at all. The captain came back on the intercom, but this time his voice was frantic. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're having some issues with the landing gear. We need to circle for a while longer while we try to reset the system." Circle? We hadn't even started to descend. We had been in the same position for what felt like an eternity. The clock on the wall above the aisle ticked loudly, and each second stretched longer than the last. The passengers were whispering now, some trying to peer out the windows, others fidgeting in their seats. Everyone was beginning to realize the same thing: something was terribly wrong. Minutes turned into half an hour, and then an hour. Still, the plane remained suspended in the air, neither climbing nor descending. The captain's updates grew less frequent, his tone more strained each time. I noticed that the flight attendants had stopped moving about the cabin entirely. They sat, staring at their hands, murmuring among themselves in hushed voices. Some passengers began to press their faces against the windows, their expressions growing more desperate. "We've been trying to get the landing gear functioning, but it's not responding," the captain said after a long silence. "We're going to attempt a manual landing approach. Please remain calm." Manual? We hadn't even touched the ground yet. My pulse quickened as I realized that we might not be able to land at all. There were no other options. We couldn't just stay up here forever. Suddenly, the plane lurched, its nose dipping slightly, but just as quickly, it jerked back into its stationary position. The sound of the engines shifted, an ominous whine that filled the cabin. I could feel the weight of the air around me, pressing down, as if the plane were struggling against something unseen. And that's when I heard it. A deep, resonant sound coming from somewhere beneath the plane. It was like the growl of an engine that refused to start, but it was much more organic. Like something had wrapped itself around the plane, keeping it from moving. The captain's voice came again, shaking now. "We have lost all contact with the control tower. I repeat, we have no connection with ground control. The airport is unable to assist us. We are on our own." A collective gasp echoed through the cabin. We were cut off. The very thing that should have guided us, communication with the ground, had been severed. The crew was left with no choice but to figure it out themselves. I could hear the panic rising among the passengers as murmurs turned into voices, pleading for reassurance. The plane shifted again, and I felt a jolt of motion. Not up, not down, but sideways. We were drifting. Slowly, inch by inch, we veered off course, but there was nothing I could see in the sky to explain it. No storm. No turbulence. Just an endless stretch of blackness surrounding us. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the plane lurched downward. My stomach flipped, and the pressure in my ears built up so fast I thought they might burst. The descent was terrifyingly rapid, but there was no ground in sight. I felt my body press hard into the seat, the familiar pull of gravity now turning against me. The captain screamed into the intercom, "Brace for impact." But the impact never came. Instead, everything went silent. The plane stopped. The engines cut out, and the sound of the wind rushing past the fuselage died away. For a moment, I thought we had crashed, but there was no pain, no destruction, only a deep, suffocating quiet. And then, through the silence, I saw it. The ground was below us. The airport lights were now just beneath the plane, and somehow, impossibly, the plane was still hovering. We had made it. After all that, the plane had landed. But as we touched down, I saw something strange in the distance. The airport was empty. No other planes on the tarmac. No people at the gates. Just an empty runway stretching out into the void. And the lights, they flickered out one by one until the whole airport was swallowed by the darkness. The plane had landed, but the world outside was gone. The gas station. It was past midnight when I pulled off the highway and onto the deserted gas station. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting a dull red glow over the empty lot. I was tired, my eyes heavy, the road stretching endlessly before me. The night was silent except for the soft hum of the pumps and the occasional rattle of the wind. I had been driving for hours, a long trip with no real destination in mind, just the need to get away, to clear my head. The station seemed like a good place to stop and stretch my legs. No cars were parked anywhere, no sign of life except for the dimly lit building and the faint glow of the pumps. It felt almost abandoned, but I figured I could still grab a coffee and maybe a snack before heading back out on the road. The station wasn't like the modern ones I usually stopped at. The pump handles were old, the station itself worn and faded, like it hadn't been touched in years. I pulled up to one of the pumps, stepping out of my car, the cold night air biting at my skin. As I walked toward the station's door, I noticed something odd. The window beside the entrance had cracked, the glass spiderwebbed across its surface. Yet, the door was unlocked. The bell above the door rang as I stepped inside, the dim overhead lights flickering. The place smelled faintly of stale coffee and something else, something metallic and strange. Behind the counter, there was a man, older than I would have guessed, with a face that looked like it had been etched into stone. His eyes were distant, as if he hadn't noticed me enter, though I was sure I'd heard the door chime. I approached the counter, but he didn't greet me. His eyes were fixed on something behind me, his hands resting on the counter in front of him. His fingers twitched slightly, but I couldn't tell if he was just tired or if something was wrong. The man finally spoke, his voice low and rough. "Fill up, and then get going," he muttered, his eyes still not leaving whatever he was staring at behind me. I glanced behind me instinctively, but saw nothing unusual, just rows of dusty, unlit shelves and a few rusted signs hanging loosely from the walls. The hum of the gas pumps outside continued, as steady and unbothered as the man's presence. I shrugged off the unease crawling along my spine and made my way to the pump. The nozzle clicked as I squeezed it, filling my tank. As I stood there, the wind outside picked up, rattling the old roof of the station, and I noticed something strange. The lights in the station flickered again, this time more erratically, as though struggling to stay on. But the most unsettling part wasn't the lights, it was the shadows. They seemed to stretch longer, crawling across the floor in unnatural ways, bending and twisting as if alive. I turned back to the door, thinking of getting back into my car and leaving, but when I looked at the counter again, the man was gone. The space behind it was empty, except for a few crumpled receipts and a stained coffee mug. "Hello?" I called out, my voice suddenly unsure. I waited, but there was no answer. I walked back into the station, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I called out again, but there was still no response. The only sound was the creaking of the old building as the wind picked up, and the soft click of the gas nozzle as it finished dispensing. I stood frozen for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. And then I heard something, an almost inaudible shuffle behind the counter. I stepped forward cautiously, peering around the corner. There was no one there. But something was. At the far end of the counter, near the back wall, a small door was ajar. A narrow stairwell led down into darkness. The kind of place no one would go unless they had to. I don't know why, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me toward it. I could feel the cold air seeping from the open door, and the darkness beyond felt thick, like it was pressing against me, drawing me in. I stepped down the stairs, each creak of the old wood making my skin crawl. The air grew colder with every step, the smell of something foul mixing with the metallic scent I had noticed earlier. My heart was racing now, and I felt the weight of dread pressing down on me, as if something was waiting. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I stopped dead in my tracks. In front of me, surrounded by boxes and old gas station equipment, was something that should not have been there. The walls were lined with strange symbols, scrawled hastily in what looked like red paint or dry blood. The floor was stained dark, as if something had been dragged across it. And at the center of it all, there was a shape. It wasn't human. The figure was crouched, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Its skin was stretched tight, pale and sickly, and its eyes, those eyes, were wide and black, like hollow pits, staring directly at me. My breath caught in my throat, and I backed away instinctively, but before I could turn, I heard the sound of footsteps. Slow, heavy steps, coming from behind me. I didn't dare look. The gas station was empty again when I reached the top of the stairs. No signs of anyone, no evidence that I'd just seen something that shouldn't exist. The man was back at the counter, as though he hadn't moved at all. I rushed to the door, nearly tripping over my feet as I slammed it open. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, and I hurried to my car, throwing the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I didn't look back as I sped off, leaving the gas station behind me. But as I glanced in my rearview mirror, I could have sworn I saw the flickering lights of the gas station in the distance and a shape standing in the window, just watching. The man in the shadows. It started like any other evening. I was finishing up at the office, the last to leave, as usual. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I packed up my things and grabbed my coat, eager to get home. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet you get late at night, when the city feels almost empty. I walked to my car, glancing over my shoulder every now and then, but it was probably just the fatigue playing tricks on me. There was no one around, just the soft hum of distant traffic and the echo of my own footsteps. The parking lot was dimly lit, the farthest corner shadowed by a large dumpster. I unlocked my car and slipped inside, the engine starting with a low rumble. As I backed out of the spot, I noticed something odd. A figure standing near the dumpster. It wasn't a clear shape, more like a silhouette, but it was there, unmoving, like a shadow cast too solid to be real. I brushed it off, chalking it up to my tired mind. But then, as I drove down the street, I felt it, a sense of being watched. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The streetlights flashed by in streaks of orange, but nothing seemed to be behind me. Still, the feeling didn't go away. My heart rate quickened as I took a turn, feeling the pressure build in my chest. Maybe I was just being paranoid. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't stop thinking about the figure by the dumpster. That's when I heard it, something tapping against the window. A light, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was a loose branch brushing against the glass. But then it came again, more insistent this time, and I froze. I glanced toward the passenger side window, but there was nothing there. Just the empty road stretching on. I took a deep breath, shaking my head. "Get it together," I muttered to myself. But then, as I turned another corner, something caught my eye. A car, parked in the shadows just ahead, its headlights off. It was a small, dark vehicle, and its positioning was off. No one else was around, and the way it sat there, so still, gave me an unsettling feeling. I had an irrational urge to speed up, to get away, but I didn't. I slowed instead, just to get a better look. The driver's side window was down. I couldn't see anyone inside, but the faintest movement caught my attention. Someone, or something, was crouched low in the seat. Suddenly, my phone buzzed. I nearly jumped out of my skin, but it was just a notification, nothing urgent. I took a moment to check it, my eyes still flicking to the shadowed car. That's when I saw it in my rearview mirror, a figure, darting across the street. My blood ran cold. I couldn't make out any details, but there was no mistaking it, a person, running with a strange, jerky motion. It didn't make sense. It was too dark, too fast, and too off. I should have kept driving, but my foot hesitated over the gas pedal. The figure reached the car I had just passed, and in an instant, it disappeared into the shadows, like it had melted into the night. Panic surged through me, and I slammed my foot down on the accelerator. The car sped forward, my heart hammering in my chest. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. I couldn't shake the thought that something was following me. I turned another corner, my headlights briefly illuminating a dark alleyway. And there, standing at the entrance, was the figure again. Only now, I could see him more clearly. He was tall, with a hood pulled low over his face. His body was unnaturally still, as if he had been waiting for me. I barely had time to process what was happening before I heard a loud bang from behind me, followed by the sound of footsteps, fast and heavy, coming closer. My grip on the wheel tightened as I glanced in the rearview mirror again. The figure had appeared from the alley and was now running toward my car at an unnatural speed, too fast for a normal person. His movements were jerky, almost inhuman, like something out of a nightmare. I floored the gas pedal, swerving around a corner, but the car seemed to be keeping up with me. No matter how fast I went, it stayed right behind, its shadow following me through the night. I didn't know how long I drove, but the world outside became a blur of streetlights and dark streets. Every turn I made, every intersection, only brought me closer to the fear gnawing at my insides. The sound of the footsteps never stopped. Finally, in sheer panic, I turned into a narrow street, hoping to lose him in the maze of alleys. My eyes darted around, searching for any sign of a safe place, when I saw something that made my stomach drop. The figure was standing at the end of the alley, waiting. I slammed on the brakes, coming to a screeching halt just in time to avoid hitting him. But the instant I stopped, the air around me seemed to change. The temperature dropped, the night turning cold and suffocating. The figure took a step forward, his head slowly lifting, and for the first time, I saw his face. It was pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore straight through me. His mouth was twisted into a grin, far too wide, stretching unnaturally across his face. I couldn't breathe. My hands were trembling, my mind racing for some way to escape, but there was no way out. Not now. And then, the figure spoke, his voice low and raspy, like it was coming from the deepest part of the earth. You've been running for too long." I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My heart pounded in my chest as the man in the shadows took another step forward, his footfalls slow and deliberate. The world around me seemed to darken, the edges of my vision fading as I realized there was no escape. The escape. It was a cold, gray morning when I first heard the news. The air was thick with fog as I sipped my coffee at the local diner, the steam rising in swirls above the mug. The place was nearly empty, the few souls in the booth all staring quietly at their plates. The waitress moved from table to table, her shoes clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. Then, the loud crackle of the radio behind the counter broke the stillness. Breaking news: a group of dangerous criminals has escaped from the Stonebridge Penitentiary. Authorities are urging residents to stay indoors and report any suspicious activity. I froze mid-sip, my eyes narrowing in disbelief. Stonebridge was just a few miles away. The prison wasn't famous for its escapes, too much security, too many walls, but now, in the dead of night, a group of inmates had somehow managed to break free. I stood up, the sound of my chair scraping against the floor louder than it should have been. The waitress didn't even look at me as I paid for my coffee, leaving a tip I didn't remember giving. My mind was racing. I had to get home. The police would likely be everywhere, combing the streets for any sign of the escapees. I walked outside, the chill of the morning air biting at my skin. The streets were unusually empty. I didn't know if it was the news of the escape or the early hour, but something felt wrong. The fog made everything seem farther away than it was, the houses shrouded in an eerie mist. When I reached my car, I looked over my shoulder, out of habit more than anything else. But something caught my eye. A figure. A man stood at the edge of the fog, just far enough away that I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could tell he was watching me. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly turned away, unlocking the car door with shaking hands. As I drove home, my mind kept wandering back to that man. Was he just a passerby, or was something more sinister happening? My phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was a message from my sister. "Did you hear about the escape? Be careful. The news says they're armed and dangerous." My stomach dropped. Armed and dangerous? That changed everything. I should have listened to my instincts and turned back. But the thought of being trapped in the house while danger was on the loose. I couldn't stay put. I pulled into my driveway and got out of the car, locking it behind me. The sound of footsteps echoed in the fog, and I stopped. Slowly, I turned my head, straining to listen. At first, it was just the wind. Then, just barely, I heard it. A faint rustling, followed by the unmistakable sound of a voice. "You got the keys?" My heart nearly stopped. There, just across the street, two men stepped out of the mist. Their faces were obscured by hooded jackets, but I could make out the shapes of large, bulky bodies. They were walking, they were prowling, moving with the purpose of predators hunting their prey. I ducked behind the car, holding my breath, praying they hadn't seen me. My mind raced. What should I do? Should I run? Should I scream? But I didn't have time. I heard one of them speak again, closer now. "The house is right there. You sure she's inside?" "She's inside. And we're gonna make sure she doesn't get out. Got a score to settle." I felt my blood run cold. I didn't know what they were talking about, but I knew one thing: they weren't here for a friendly chat. I was in their way. I was about to move, to try and make it to the back of the house where I could hide, but then I heard a sound that stopped me cold, the sound of a car engine revving in the distance. More men. More criminals. My mind raced as I scanned my surroundings. I had to get inside. I had to lock the doors. But the driveway was wide open, and I didn't know where to hide. The two men across the street moved forward, disappearing into the fog. I waited a few more moments, the panic building in my chest. My breath quickened. If I didn't act now, I sprinted for the front door, my hand fumbling for the keys. Just as I turned the handle, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, too close, too fast. Before I could react, a hand shot out and grabbed my shoulder. The force spun me around, and I found myself face to face with one of the men, his hood pulled back to reveal a scarred, cruel face. "You shouldn't have run," he said with a low chuckle, tightening his grip on my arm. My body went stiff, and I tried to break free, but his hand was like a vice, crushing the bones in my wrist. I needed to think fast, to find a way out. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of sirens. Loud, piercing, close. The man cursed under his breath and released his grip, glancing down the street. "Let's move," he growled, and with that, he shoved me aside and disappeared into the fog, his footsteps fading into the distance. I didn't waste a second. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, bolting every lock. The sirens were growing louder now, and I allowed myself a moment to breathe. But as I glanced out the window, I saw something that made my blood freeze again. There, just at the edge of the fog, I saw them. The shadows of men moving together in perfect sync. The escapees hadn't gone far. And they weren't done. The creature from the mountains. I was hiking alone, as I often did, in the dense forest near the mountain range. It was late autumn, the trees just beginning to shed their leaves, creating a carpet of golden and amber beneath my boots. The air was crisp, the scent of pine and earth filling my lungs with every breath. I'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks, a quiet escape from the noise of the city, a chance to reconnect with the peace of nature. The trail was familiar, a well-trodden path that wound through the trees and up toward the base of the mountains. I knew this area like the back of my hand, and yet something felt off that day. A tension in the air, an unfamiliar heaviness that made me uneasy. It wasn't the usual quiet. There was an absence of sound, no birds chirping or rustling of leaves in the wind. Even the air felt still, as if the world around me had paused. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the isolation getting to me. Maybe it was the change in weather or my own nerves. But as I continued up the path, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't until I reached the clearing at the foot of the mountain that I truly felt it, the sense of something lurking in the shadows. The trees parted slightly, allowing me a view of the rocky face of the mountain, jagged and imposing against the gray sky. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a patch of shadow moving strangely between the rocks. But then, it moved again, unmistakably real. A figure. Tall, hulking, and crouched low, almost animalistic in shape. Its eyes glinted in the low light, yellow and unblinking. The creature had the body of something monstrous, its limbs long and unnaturally stretched, covered in dark fur that blended with the shadows. A massive, twisted face peered from behind a rock, and for a moment I could have sworn it smiled at me, the grotesque grin stretching far too wide for any human or animal. I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet were planted to the ground, my breath coming shallow and quick. The creature's eyes never left me as it moved slowly, deliberately, its claws scraping against the stone as it shifted into full view. I realized then that I wasn't alone in this place. There was something ancient here, something that had been waiting for far longer than I could understand. The creature let out a low growl, deep and resonant, sending a shiver through my spine. I turned and bolted, my heart pounding in my chest. The path back to the main trail was just a few hundred meters away, but it felt like miles. I could hear it behind me, heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush, a rhythmic, terrifying sound that grew closer with every second. The wind picked up, whipping through the trees, but it only seemed to amplify the sounds of its pursuit. My breath came faster, the weight of panic sinking into my chest. I risked a glance over my shoulder, but I couldn't see it clearly anymore. Just a blur of movement, too fast, too monstrous to be real. I pushed harder, my legs burning with the effort, the familiar trail now seeming impossibly distant. The creature was still behind me, its presence like a dark cloud pressing in. There was no time to think, no time to reason with the fear clawing at me. Finally, I reached the clearing where I had entered, and in my desperation, I made the mistake of looking back again. In that split second, I saw it clearly, a towering silhouette against the trees, its eyes gleaming like twin lanterns in the dark. It stopped, dead in its tracks. The air around it seemed to ripple with an unnatural force, and I could feel the pressure, as if the very ground beneath me had become a trap. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it vanished into the shadows of the mountains, leaving nothing but the distant echo of its growl in the silence. I stood there for a long time, unable to move, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. My body trembled, the adrenaline slowly fading into exhaustion. I had to leave. I couldn't stay another second in that place, knowing what was waiting in the mountains. I didn't look back again as I hurried down the path, the safety of the trail now a distant hope. It wasn't until I reached the car, panting and covered in sweat, that I dared to glance over my shoulder one last time. The mountains loomed in the distance, dark and silent. But this time, I wasn't imagining it. At the very top, I saw a shadow, a fleeting movement that sent a chill straight to my core. The creature was still out there, waiting. The shadow in the glass. I never thought it would come to this. The booze had taken everything from me, my job, my family, my dignity. But it had also given me something in return, numbness. For a while, that was enough. I could drink myself into oblivion and forget. Forget the guilt, the shame, the anger. But one night, as I stumbled home from yet another failed attempt at self-discipline, things started to change. It was just another late night at the bar. The usual crowd of drunks sat hunched over their drinks, nursing their loneliness in silence. I wasn't even tipsy when I left, just worn down, drained by the weight of my own existence. The cool air outside did little to clear my foggy mind. I made my way down the empty streets, the hum of the streetlights flickering in the distance. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought she was just another woman walking down the street, but there was something about her, something that made my skin prickle, something that didn't sit right. She was dressed in black, her hair dark and tangled, her face pale but somehow striking. But it wasn't her appearance that caught my attention. It was the way she moved. She was too graceful, too fluid. Her footsteps didn't quite touch the ground, as if the air itself bent to her will. I slowed my pace, my breath catching in my chest. She looked at me then, her eyes locking with mine, cold, dark, almost knowing. And just like that, I knew. This wasn't a normal woman. She wasn't human. I tried to turn away, but something tugged at me. A force, an invisible thread that wouldn't let me go. I found myself following her, my feet moving without my permission. The more I walked, the further I felt from reality, until it was just her and me, the street fading into a blur. She stopped at an alley, and I couldn't stop myself from entering. The air grew thick, stifling, as though the space itself had been trapped in a spell. I wanted to run. I knew I should run. But the temptation was unbearable. She turned to face me, her lips curling into a smile that wasn't a smile at all. "Do you want to forget?" she asked, her voice low and smooth, like silk dragging across skin. I swallowed, feeling a cold sweat break out on my skin. "What do you mean?" I stammered, barely able to keep my voice steady. She stepped closer, and I could smell her then, sweet, intoxicating, almost nauseating. "I can take it all away," she whispered. "The pain, the regret, the loneliness. All you need to do is ask." I didn't understand, but I could feel it. Deep down, I knew. Whatever she was offering, it came at a price. But the alcohol in my veins made the decision easy. The numbness, the escape, it was all I wanted now. What could one more drink, one more indulgence, hurt? "Yes," I found myself saying, my voice barely audible. "I want to forget." Her smile widened, showing teeth too sharp to be human. "Then let me help you," she said, her fingers brushing my cheek in a way that made my heart race and my skin crawl. She pressed herself against me, her lips brushing my ear, and I felt it, a sharp, icy thrill that ran through my veins, colder than any drink I'd ever had. And that's when it happened. The world around me shifted. The alley stretched, twisted, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I saw flashes, images of things that didn't belong in my world. Dark figures, crawling shadows, a sense of hunger, of deep, gnawing desire. And then, I saw her face again. Her eyes. They were no longer just eyes, they were pools of darkness, sucking me in, pulling me deeper. I could feel her breath on my neck, cold and thick, as her voice coiled around me. "You wanted to forget," she whispered, her voice like claws scraping across my soul. "But now you will remember, forever." I stumbled back, heart pounding, my stomach churning. I could still feel her presence around me, the coldness seeping into my bones. I turned and ran, desperate to escape, to make sense of what was happening. But it was no use. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, her smile, her eyes, hovering just beyond my reach, waiting. The next morning, I woke up in my apartment, drenched in sweat, my body shaking. My hands reached for the bottle beside the bed without thought, the familiar burn of whiskey burning my throat, a temporary reprieve. But it didn't work anymore. It didn't make the visions go away. For the next few weeks, I saw her in the corners of my vision, in the reflections of windows, in the shadows of the night. Her voice would whisper in my ear while I was alone, coaxing, tempting. She was always there, always waiting, growing stronger with every drink I took. I tried to tell myself it was just the alcohol, the withdrawal. Maybe I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew. She wasn't a hallucination. She wasn't a figment of my imagination. She was real. And she had come for me. Every night, she came. And every night, I slipped deeper into her world. It wasn't until I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror that I understood. My eyes, they were different. Darker. Hollow. I had become a part of her, a part of whatever nightmare she came from. The alcohol, the escapism, had only opened the door. And now, I was trapped. I had asked to forget. But in the end, I had only forgotten how to live. The silent visitor. It was just another evening shift at the hospital. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, the steady beeping of machines creating a rhythmic backdrop to the usual hum of activity. I was a nurse, working the night shift in a small, quiet wing of the hospital. The patients were few, the staff even fewer, and the night passed as it always did, slowly, with the occasional call for help or medical emergency. The smell of antiseptic lingered in the air, as it always did, masking the sharp scent of sterilization that seemed to haunt every corner of the building. But that night, something felt different. It began with Mrs. Hargrave, a long-time patient who had been in and out of the hospital for weeks. She was an elderly woman, frail and weak, but always sharp in her mind. She had been getting worse recently, her health deteriorating despite all the treatments. That night, when I entered her room to check on her vitals, she was staring at the corner of the room, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe. "Mrs. Hargrave, are you all right?" I asked, approaching her bed, but she didn't respond. Her gaze remained fixed on the corner, her breathing shallow. "Who's there?" she whispered, barely audible. "Who's standing in the shadows?" I glanced over my shoulder, expecting perhaps a nurse or a visitor, but the room was empty. The curtains were drawn, the dim light from the hallway filtering through, casting long shadows along the walls. There was no one there. "Mrs. Hargrave, there's no one here," I said gently, taking her hand. But she didn't respond. Instead, she shivered and pulled the covers tighter around her, as though trying to protect herself from something unseen. "It's coming closer," she murmured, her voice cracking. "It's waiting." I tried to calm her, but as I watched her, a strange feeling washed over me, a sense of unease that I couldn't explain. I dismissed it as fatigue, chalking it up to the stress of the night shift. But as the night wore on, things started to get stranger. A few hours later, I was making my rounds when I passed by the ICU, where the most critical patients were kept. I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow, moving against the flow of light in the hallway. It was brief, just a flicker, but it made my heart race. I stopped for a moment, looking around. The hallway was empty. I was alone. I shook my head and continued on, but the sense of being watched grew stronger, like someone was standing just out of sight, observing my every move. I could feel it, a presence just beyond my reach. It wasn't until I reached room 24 that things took a darker turn. A young man, Mr. Jenkins, had been in a coma for days after a car accident. His condition was critical, and there was little hope of recovery. As I entered his room to check on him, I saw the shadow again, this time hovering by his bed. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the dim light filtering through the blinds, but it was there. A dark, indistinct shape that didn't belong in the room. I froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the temperature in the room seemed to drop, a chill settling over me that I couldn't explain. I looked at Mr. Jenkins, his pale face as still as always, his breathing shallow but steady. But then, as I stared at him, I saw his fingers twitch, just a little, then stop. The shadow seemed to shift, slowly, as though it had noticed me watching. And that's when I realized it wasn't just the shadows. There was something else in the room. I backed away, heart pounding in my chest, and as I turned to leave, I heard a faint sound, a soft whisper, barely audible, coming from the corner of the room. It was as though someone was speaking in a language I couldn't understand, their voice distant yet strangely familiar. I didn't wait to listen. I left the room quickly, my mind racing, my hands trembling. That night, the events only escalated. In the break room, I overheard a conversation between two doctors. They were discussing the strange occurrences that had been happening for the past few days, patients mentioning seeing figures in their rooms, whispering voices, the temperature dropping suddenly in certain areas of the hospital. "It's happening again," one of them said, his voice low and grim. "It's like it always does. The presence. It comes for the patients who are closest." "Closest to what?" the other doctor asked. "To the end," the first doctor replied, his eyes heavy with a sort of knowing dread. "It comes for them before they go." I didn't ask any more questions, but as I continued my rounds, I couldn't shake the feeling of something closing in. Every time I passed a room, I could feel it, a presence, watching me, lurking just beyond the door. And then, the worst happened. Mrs. Hargrave passed away around 3 in the morning. I was there when it happened, sitting by her bed, trying to comfort her in her final moments. I had no idea how long she'd been seeing the shadow, or what she truly meant by its waiting, but when her eyes fluttered closed, I felt it. The air grew heavy, thick with something I couldn't explain. As I stood up to check for a pulse, I saw it. The figure, standing in the corner of the room. Its form was dark, indistinct, but unmistakable. It stood there, just watching, as if it had been waiting for this moment. For her. I backed out of the room slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me, and I could hear them clearly now. "It's your time," they said. I didn't stay in that hospital another night. I couldn't. The shadows had taken a life of their own, and I realized then that death wasn't just something that came for the patients, it had made its home in the walls of the hospital. And now, I could see it too. The Vintage Killer. It was an unusually warm evening when I first laid eyes on it. I had been walking through the back alley behind the auto repair shop, trying to find the best route to my car when I saw it parked under the flickering streetlight. The car. It was a sleek, black classic, an old muscle car with a design that spoke of a time long past when cars were built for speed and power. The body gleamed under the dim light, its chrome accents shining like polished teeth. I had been working as a mechanic in the small town for years, and I'd seen all kinds of vehicles come through our doors, but this one was different. It was a rare find, one of those cars that enthusiasts would kill to own, a model that had been off the market for decades. It was like something out of a collector's dream, but something about it felt wrong. I stopped and stared at it for a while, my curiosity getting the best of me. There were no tags, no signs of ownership, just the car, standing there, almost waiting. The only thing I noticed that was odd was the faint smell of gasoline, even though the engine wasn't running. Beautiful, isn't it? I turned to find Tim, the owner of the shop, standing behind me with a sly smile. He was the kind of guy who always had a story to tell, no matter how bizarre or unbelievable. "You know anything about it?" I asked, unable to hide my fascination. Tim's eyes flickered for a moment, and then he shrugged. "Not much. It came in a few days ago, dropped off in the middle of the night. No name, no papers. Just the car. I frowned, still staring at it. Who would leave something like this behind? Tim didn't answer immediately, and there was a pause, a brief moment of hesitation. Some cars aren't meant to be driven, he said softly, almost as though he were speaking to himself. I didn't think much of it at the time. Tim had always been the type to get caught up in superstitions or weird rumors. But that night, as I left the shop and drove home, I couldn't shake the image of the car from my mind. It was like it was calling to me. The next morning, I decided to go back and take a closer look. I wasn't sure why, but something felt off about that vehicle, something beyond its pristine condition. When I arrived, the car was still there, parked exactly where it had been the night before. But this time, something was different. The hood of the car was open, as if someone had been working on it. I approached cautiously, my fingers grazing the metal. There was something strange about the way it felt, colder than it should have been, as if the engine had been running just moments ago. I heard a noise behind me, and before I could react, I felt the presence of someone else in the alley. Spinning around, I saw a figure stepping out of the shadows. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a worn leather jacket. His face was hidden in the darkness, but his eyes glowed in the faint light. "Is this your car?" I asked, my voice tight with a strange unease. The man didn't answer. Instead, he just stared at me, his gaze unblinking. It was like he was studying me, measuring me in some way. Tim said it was abandoned, I added, hoping to break the silence. The man stepped closer, his boots scraping against the pavement. I took a step back, my heart starting to race. There was something wrong with him, his movements were too stiff, too deliberate, as if he was following a script. "You don't understand," he said finally, his voice low and gravelly. "The car isn't abandoned. It's been waiting for someone who needs it." I didn't know what he meant by that, but I had the sinking feeling I wasn't going to like the answer. "What do you mean?" The man's lips curled into a twisted smile. "It takes what it needs." Suddenly, everything fell into place. The car wasn't just a machine, it was something else, something alive, something that had been waiting for the right person to come along. And now that I was here, I had become its prey. I tried to turn and run, but it was too late. The man lunged at me, grabbing me by the arm with a strength I couldn't have anticipated. I struggled, my pulse pounding in my ears, but his grip was like iron. "Don't bother," he whispered, his face inches from mine. "It's already in your blood." I felt a sharp pain in my chest, a sudden pressure that felt like something was twisting inside me. My vision blurred, and I stumbled back, trying to break free, but it was like the world was closing in around me. The car I had been so drawn to, was no longer just a machine. It was feeding on me, drawing me into its darkness, its hunger. The man let go, his hands slipping off me like he was releasing a captive animal. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, the pain overwhelming. As I lay there, unable to move, I saw the car again. The headlights flickered to life, casting a blood-red glow over the alley. The engine revved, and I could feel the vibrations in my bones. It was coming for me, slowly, deliberately, like a predator closing in on its prey. I tried to scream, but my throat was dry, my body unresponsive. The last thing I saw was the car, its headlights glaring down on me, its engine roaring louder with each passing second. And then, there was nothing. When they found me, hours later, my body was cold, my skin pale. There was no sign of struggle, no wounds, no visible injury. But the look in my eyes, the look of someone who had seen death, was enough to tell them something had gone terribly wrong. The car was gone, of course. No one knew where it went or why it had chosen me. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was the tire tracks found leading away from the alley, the tracks that circled around me as though the car had come to inspect its kill and then simply driven off. It wasn't over, though. Every time someone talked about the car, I felt it, its presence, calling to me, waiting for the next victim. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't finished with me. The Forbidden Passage. It was a quiet afternoon when I first noticed it, the narrow, almost invisible door at the back of the old thrift store I worked at. I had been working there for months, organizing shelves and sorting through donations, but I had never seen this door before. It was hidden behind a stack of old crates near the back of the shop, so well concealed that it seemed like it had always been there, just waiting to be discovered. It was made of thick, withered wood, the kind that looked ancient even though the shop itself was no more than a few decades old. The door wasn't labeled, no sign to give away what it might lead to, but there was something about it that tugged at me, something I couldn't ignore. I brushed it off at first, thinking it was just some forgotten storage area that had been left locked for years. But the longer I worked in this store, the more the door seemed to pull me in. Sometimes, when I was alone in the shop, I could hear strange sounds coming from behind it, soft whispers, like the rustling of paper or the faintest sound of footsteps. It was never enough to be sure, but it was enough to unsettle me, to make me wonder about what lay beyond that door. One evening, when the shop was unusually empty and I was finishing up my shift, I found myself standing in front of it. I don't know what drove me to open it. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe it was something darker, something more primal, an instinct that told me I needed to know. I hesitated for a moment, my hand resting on the cool brass handle. The air around me seemed heavier, thicker, as if the world had grown still, waiting. Then, without thinking, I twisted the knob and pushed the door open. The room beyond was dark, the kind of darkness that made you feel like something was watching you. At first, I couldn't make out much, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat, a narrow stairway leading down, descending into nothingness. The steps were made of cracked stone, worn smooth from years of use, but there was something strange about them, something off. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and mildew, as if the stairs had been forgotten for centuries. And yet, despite the chill in the air, I felt a strange pull, an urge to go down, to see where they led. Without thinking, I stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind me, and I was plunged into complete darkness. I fumbled for a light, but there was nothing, no flicker of a bulb, no beam of light from the cracks in the walls. I was alone, the silence suffocating. I hesitated for a moment, but then I heard something, a faint rustling sound from below, as if something was moving, something breathing. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My pulse quickened. I wanted to turn back, to slam the door shut and forget I had ever opened it, but the pull of curiosity was too strong. Slowly, I descended the stairs, the air growing colder with every step. And then, I reached the bottom. The room I entered was unlike anything I had ever seen. The walls were covered in strange symbols, painted in what looked like blood. The floor was smooth, dark stone, and in the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror, its frame twisted with grotesque designs, faces that seemed to contort in agony, their eyes wide and empty. It was beautiful, in a way, but also terrifying. I felt a sharp, prickling sensation at the back of my mind, like something was reaching out to touch me, but I couldn't see what. As I approached the mirror, I felt my heart hammering in my chest. I reached out, my hand trembling, and placed my fingers against the cold surface of the glass. At first, nothing happened. But then, the reflection began to shift. Slowly, the surface of the mirror rippled, like water disturbed by a stone. The image that appeared wasn't mine, not at all. It was a dark, twisted version of myself, standing in a dim, shadowy place that seemed to stretch on forever. The figure in the mirror grinned at me, but its smile was wrong, too wide, too sharp. Its eyes were empty black pits, voids that seemed to suck in all the light around them. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The figure in the mirror reached out, its hand pressing against the glass, and for a brief moment, I thought it was trying to pull me in. I backed away, my mind racing, my body frozen in fear. The whispers I had heard before were louder now, almost deafening, swirling around me like a whirlwind. I turned to run, but the door was gone. The stairway was gone. There was no way out. The mirror began to pulse with an eerie light, and I felt something cold and ancient, brush against my skin. I spun around, my eyes wide, trying to find the exit, but there was nothing but the oppressive darkness closing in on me. I could feel the presence in the room, a presence that wasn't just in the air, but in my very bones. The whispers turned into words, and the words were clear now. Stay. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in a world that wasn't my own. The reflection in the mirror twisted again, showing me 1,000 different versions of myself, each one more distorted, more grotesque than the last. And then, I heard a voice, soft, breathy, and cold. You shouldn't have opened the door. The last thing I remember was the mirror pulling me in, the darkness swallowing me whole. I woke up the next morning in the store, as though nothing had happened. The door was gone, and the shop was just as it had always been. But I knew something had changed. I could still hear the whispers, faint but constant, echoing in the back of my mind. And now, every time I walk through the store, I feel the pull again. The door might not be there anymore, but the passage still calls to me. It's waiting for me. The lighthouse in the forest. I had always heard the stories, the whispered tales passed between locals with cautious glances and hushed voices. The lighthouse. They said it stood deep in the forest, hidden away from the world, casting its beam through the trees on the rarest of nights. A lighthouse in the middle of a forest? It didn't make sense. But the older people in town swore by it, and I always dismissed it as superstition, a ghost story for tourists. That was until I found myself standing at the edge of the forest one evening, staring into the thick trees that seemed to stretch on forever. It had been a long day of hiking, and I had lost track of time. The setting sun cast an orange glow over the landscape, and the forest was quieter than I had ever known. But something about the stillness felt off. It was as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting. I had come out here to explore, to find something different, but now, as the shadows grew longer and the air cooler, I had second thoughts. Maybe I should turn back. But that old curiosity, the one that had gotten me into trouble more than once, pushed me forward. I heard stories about the lighthouse. I wanted to see it for myself. I didn't know how far I had been walking when I first saw it, a tall silhouette looming between the trees, its structure thin and haunting, its bright white paint chipped and worn by the passage of time. A lighthouse. In the middle of the forest. I approached cautiously, my heart beating faster with every step. The trees seemed to close in around me, the thick underbrush making the path harder to follow. But there it was, rising above the canopy, the beam of light cutting through the darkness, shining brightly against the evening sky. I couldn't understand how it was there. There was no sea for miles, no reason for a lighthouse to be placed in the heart of the woods. Yet, as I stood before it, I could see the faint, eerie glow coming from its glass lantern at the top, the light sweeping across the trees as though it were searching for something or someone. I took a deep breath and pushed open the rusted door. It creaked loudly, sending a chill down my spine, and I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, the walls covered in moss and mildew, and the stairs that spiraled upward looked like they hadn't been used in decades. Yet, the light continued to shine, uninterrupted. I began my ascent, my footsteps echoing in the hollow space. Each step seemed heavier than the last, and the higher I went, the more the air seemed to change. It was colder up here, unnaturally cold, and the faint hum of the light above grew louder, more insistent, as though it were calling to me. When I reached the top, I finally came face to face with the lantern. The light was blinding, almost unbearable, yet there was something mesmerizing about it, something hypnotic that drew me in. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, and the longer I stood there, the more I felt as if I was being pulled closer to the glass. That's when I heard it, a faint sound, a whisper, carried on the wind. It was almost imperceptible, a soft murmur that seemed to come from the light itself. I leaned closer, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The whisper grew louder, more distinct. Get out while you still can." I froze, my breath catching in my chest. The voice was clear now, as if someone, or something, was standing just behind me, urging me to leave. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and panic surged through me. I turned to run, but the door I had come through was gone. The room had changed. The walls had closed in, the stairs I had climbed were now nothing more than a dark abyss. I stumbled back, my mind spinning, as the lighthouse began to hum louder. The glass of the lantern flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. I could feel the walls pressing in, the air growing thick, and the light seemed to pulse with a rhythm that wasn't natural. Then, I saw it, a figure, standing just beyond the edge of the light, shrouded in darkness. It was tall, its features hidden in the shadows, but I could feel its presence, its cold, suffocating presence. It watched me, its eyes glowing with an unearthly light. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't human. It had come from the light, or maybe it had always been there, waiting, guarding the lighthouse. The beam of light swung again, and for a moment, the figure was revealed, its face twisted in a grotesque, silent scream. It was then that I understood the lighthouse wasn't just a beacon for ships. It was a beacon for something far worse. I ran. I didn't think, I just ran. The world around me had turned into a blur of trees and darkness as I raced down the spiral stairs. My breath came in sharp gasps, my legs aching, but I couldn't stop. The sound of footsteps echoed behind me, and I could feel the presence of something pursuing me, as if the forest itself had come alive and was hunting me down. I burst out of the lighthouse, stumbling into the forest, the trees closing in around me. The light from the top of the tower flickered one last time before it went dark. Silence fell, and for a moment, I dared to believe I had escaped. But then, I heard it again, the whisper, faint but unmistakable. "You can never leave." I ran, and I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the forest, gasping for breath. The lighthouse was gone. The trees were still. There was no trace of the path I had followed, no sign of the building that had haunted me. It was as if the forest had swallowed it whole. But every night, I hear the whisper again, carried on the wind. And every time, I feel the pull, the eerie beckoning from deep within the trees. The lighthouse is waiting, and I know one day I'll be drawn back. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.